Welcome, guardian of Gotham's dreams, to a journey through the shadows where young heroes are forged in tragedy and triumph. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of those who have worn the red and yellow, who have answered the call to stand beside the Dark Knight in his eternal war against the darkness. From circus tents to city streets, from loss to redemption, these are the tales of the Robins, the boy wonders, and girl warriors who transformed pain into purpose. Close your eyes, protector of hope, and let these stories of courage and growth carry you into peaceful slumber. In the golden age of American entertainment, when the traveling circus represented wonder and magic to communities across the nation, there existed a family whose very name had become synonymous with grace, courage, and the defiance of gravity itself. The Flying Graysons were not merely performers but artists of the impossible, acrobats whose movements through the air seemed to mock the fundamental laws that bound ordinary mortals to the earth below. Their act was poetry written in motion, a testament to what human beings could achieve when they dedicated themselves completely to the pursuit of perfection in their chosen craft. John and Mary Grayson had met under the big top, two young performers from different circus families, whose shared passion for flight had blossomed into love and eventually into a partnership that transcended mere romance to become something approaching the sacred. They understood each other in ways that went beyond words, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization through routines that required absolute trust and flawless communication. When Mary became pregnant, there was never any question that their child would be raised in the world they had created together, surrounded by sawdust and spotlight, learning the ancient secrets of balance and timing that had been passed down through generations of circus families. Richard John Grayson entered the world on a crisp autumn evening in a small town whose name would be forgotten by history, yet whose significance would echo through the decades in ways that no one present at his birth could have anticipated. From his first breath, Dick breathed the air of the circus, his earliest lullabies the distant sounds of audiences gasping in wonder and applauding in appreciation, the smells of popcorn and cotton candy, the sight of colorful banners fluttering in the breeze, the organized chaos of performers preparing for shows. All of these became the natural environment in which his consciousness developed and his understanding of the world took shape. By the age of 3, when most children were still struggling to master basic coordination and balance, Dick was already displaying an intuitive understanding of movement and space that amazed even the veteran performers who had spent decades perfecting their craft. His parents began incorporating him into their practices, not as a formal performer but as a natural extension of their own movements, teaching him to trust his instincts and embrace the sensation of flight that would define his relationship with the physical world for the remainder of his existence. The training that Dick received was unlike anything experienced by children in conventional families. Yet it was also infused with a love and care that made every lesson feel like play rather than work. John taught him the importance of strength and conditioning, showing him how the human body could be transformed into an instrument of grace and power through dedicated effort and intelligent practice. Mary instilled in him the artistic sensibilities that elevated mere athletic ability into something approaching transcendence, helping him understand that true performance required not just physical perfection, but emotional connection with the audience who had chosen to share in their aerial dreams. The first time Dick performed publicly, stepping onto the platform high above the crowd at the tender age of 8, he felt no fear or nervousness, but rather a profound sense of homecoming, as if he had finally arrived at the place where he truly belonged. The spotlight that followed his movements felt like warm sunlight, the gasps and cheers of the audience below like a chorus of approval for choices that felt as natural as breathing. When he completed his routine and took his bow, the smile that spread across his young face was not one of relief or accomplishment, but of pure joy. The recognition that he had found his calling in life. The years that followed were filled with continuous growth and development, as Dick's natural abilities were refined through constant practice and performance. The Haley Circus became his classroom, the other performers his teachers, the audiences they entertained. His inspiration to reach ever greater heights of skill and artistry. He learned not only the technical aspects of acrobatics, but also the subtler lessons about timing, showmanship, and the responsibility that came with the privilege of bringing wonder into the lives of others. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence, forces were stirring that would ultimately shatter the world that Dick had known and loved, transforming his story from one of simple achievement into something far more complex and tragic. The criminal underworld that infected every aspect of American society during those tumultuous decades had not overlooked the traveling circuses, viewing them as opportunities for extortion and exploitation rather than celebrations of human achievement and artistic expression. Tony Zuko was a man whose very name carried whispers of violence and corruption, a representative of organized crime whose business model depended upon the suffering and fear of those who could not defend themselves against his particular brand of intimidation. His approach to the circus was methodical and ruthless, demanding protection money from performers and management alike, while making it clear that refusal to cooperate would result in consequences that extended far beyond mere financial loss. The conversation that young Dick overheard between Zuko's representatives and the circus management was conducted in the language of euphemism and implication. Yet the underlying threat was unmistakable to anyone who understood the realities of criminal enterprise. The Flying Graysons, as the circus's star attraction and primary draw for audiences, were specifically mentioned as examples of valuable assets that would be unfortunate to lose due to preventable accidents or mechanical failures. The moral complexity that Dick faced in that moment would have challenged the ethical reasoning of individuals far older and more experienced in the ways of the world. He possessed knowledge that could potentially prevent tragedy. Yet he was also a child, whose understanding of adult concerns and criminal methodology was necessarily limited. The decision to remain silent was not born of cowardice or indifference, but rather of the natural hesitation that comes from uncertainty about consequences and the appropriate channels for reporting concerns that existed primarily in the realm of implication rather than explicit threat. The sabotage of the trapeze equipment was conducted with the precision of professionals who understood exactly how to create catastrophic failure while maintaining the appearance of accidental malfunction. The chemical treatment applied to the ropes was designed to weaken the fibers gradually, ensuring that collapse would occur during performance when maximum psychological impact could be achieved, while minimizing the likelihood of forensic evidence that could definitively establish criminal intent. The night of the final performance was marked by an atmosphere of excitement and anticipation that made the subsequent tragedy even more devastating in its emotional impact. The audience was larger than usual, filled with families and children who had come to witness the magic that the Flying Graysons represented, expecting to leave with memories of wonder and joy, rather than trauma and loss that would haunt them for years to come. Dick's position in the rigging that evening provided him with a perfect vantage point to observe not only his parents' performance, but also the subtle signs of equipment failure that became apparent in the moments before catastrophe struck. The slight fraying of rope fibers, the unusual tension in supporting cables, the barely perceptible wobble in the platform that should have remained rock steady, all combined to create a growing sense of unease that he could not quite articulate or act upon in time to prevent what followed. The moment when the equipment failed was both instantaneous and eternal. A heartbeat during which the fundamental assumptions that governed Dick's understanding of reality were shattered beyond repair. The ropes that had supported countless performances without incident suddenly snapped with sounds like gunshots, sending John and Mary Grayson plummeting toward the circus floor far below, while their son watched helplessly from his position in the rigging system. The impact that ended their lives was mercifully quick, sparing them the prolonged suffering that might have accompanied a less immediately fatal fall, yet providing no comfort to the child who witnessed their destruction and understood with crystalline clarity that his world had ended along with their heartbeats. The silence that followed the accident was more deafening than any sound Dick had ever heard, a void into which his childhood disappeared and from which a very different version of himself would eventually emerge. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy was characterized by the kind of organized chaos that emerges when trained professionals must respond to catastrophic events that exceed their normal experience and preparation. Emergency medical personnel who arrived expecting to treat injuries found themselves dealing with fatalities, while circus management struggled to contain the psychological damage to both audiences and performers, while also addressing the practical concerns of potential liability and criminal investigation. Bruce Wayne's presence at the circus that evening was initially unremarkable, simply another wealthy patron enjoying entertainment that provided temporary escape from the burdens of responsibility and the isolation that came with extraordinary privilege. Yet his response to the tragedy revealed depths of character and understanding that transformed what might have been mere spectator sympathy into something approaching personal mission. The recognition that Dick felt when he first looked into Bruce's eyes was not based on conscious knowledge or logical deduction, but rather on an intuitive understanding that here was someone who comprehended loss in ways that most people could never fully grasp. The orphaning that had shaped Bruce's own development provided him with insights into the psychological trauma that Dick was experiencing, while his resources and determination offered possibilities for healing and growth that would not have been available through conventional channels. The decision to take Dick into his home was not made impulsively or from simple charitable impulse, but rather from Bruce's recognition that the child possessed qualities and potential that deserved nurturing and development even in the wake of devastating tragedy. The intelligence that Dick displayed in his analysis of the equipment failure, the physical capabilities that had been developed through years of acrobatic training, and most importantly, the strength of character that prevented complete psychological collapse in the face of overwhelming loss, all suggested that this particular orphan might be capable of transforming his pain into something constructive and meaningful. The Wayne Manor that Dick entered as a traumatized child was a place designed to accommodate secrets and hidden purposes. Its Gothic architecture and labyrinthine passages reflecting the complex nature of its owner's public and private identities. The wealth and luxury that surrounded him provided physical comfort and security that helped stabilize his immediate circumstances. Yet the true healing began when he discovered that his guardian's apparent normalcy concealed depths of purpose and mission that resonated with his own need to find meaning in tragedy. The training that Bruce provided went far beyond the academic education and social development that would have been considered adequate for most children of privilege, encompassing instead a comprehensive program designed to develop every aspect of human potential while maintaining careful attention to psychological health and emotional stability. Dick learned not only traditional subjects like history, mathematics, and literature, but also skills that most educators would never consider appropriate for children: forensic analysis, criminal psychology, advanced martial arts, and the subtle arts of investigation and deduction. The revelation of Bruce's identity as Batman came not through dramatic disclosure but through gradual understanding, as Dick's natural detective abilities combined with extended observation to pierce the carefully constructed veil of secrecy that protected Gotham's greatest secret. The moment of confirmation, when he awakened in the Batcave after his unauthorized investigation into his parents' murder, marked the beginning of a new phase in his development that would transform him from a ward seeking justice into a partner committed to a larger mission. The connection between Tony Zuko and the Grayson murders was established through meticulous investigation that combined Bruce's resources and methodology with Dick's intimate knowledge of circus operations and the specific circumstances surrounding the tragedy. The evidence that emerged painted a clear picture of criminal conspiracy designed to intimidate the entire traveling circus community while eliminating potential witnesses to illegal activities that extended far beyond simple extortion. Zuko's death from an apparent heart attack before his arrest could be completed represented a form of cosmic justice that satisfied neither Dick's need for closure nor Bruce's commitment to due process and legal resolution. The criminal had escaped earthly punishment through the ultimate loophole, leaving behind questions that could never be answered and grievances that could never be formally addressed through conventional channels. The offer that Bruce made to Dick in the aftermath of these revelations was unprecedented in the history of vigilante justice, an opportunity for a child to become an active participant in the war against crime, rather than simply a victim seeking personal vengeance. The creation of the Robin identity represented not just a costume and code name, but a fundamental reimagining of what heroism could mean when it was guided by hope rather than driven by darkness. The name Robin carried profound personal significance for Dick, connecting his new mission to the loving nickname that his mother had used during their most intimate moments together, transforming a term of endearment into a symbol of justice and protection. The costume that was designed for him incorporated elements of the Flying Grayson's performance attire, ensuring that his parents' memory would be honored in every act of heroism he performed, while also serving as a constant reminder of the values and principles that had shaped his earliest development. The training that Dick underwent to prepare for active participation in Batman's mission was unlike anything that had been attempted in the history of crime fighting, requiring the adaptation of adult-level skills and techniques to the physical and psychological capabilities of a child, while maintaining careful attention to safety and developmental appropriateness. The months of preparation that preceded his first patrol tested not only his physical abilities, but also his mental resilience and emotional stability under conditions designed to simulate the stresses and challenges of real combat. The final examination that Bruce required before approving Dick for active duty was perhaps the most comprehensive test of survival skills ever administered to someone of his age, requiring him to evade capture by one of the world's greatest detectives while navigating the urban environment that would become his primary theater of operations. The successful completion of this challenge demonstrated not only technical competence, but also the creative thinking and adaptability that would become hallmarks of his approach to crime fighting throughout his career. The first night that Dick took to the streets, as Robin marked the beginning of a partnership that would redefine both participants, while also establishing new possibilities for what heroic action could accomplish when it was guided by wisdom and tempered by compassion. The criminals who encountered this new presence in Gotham's shadows found themselves facing not just Batman's intimidating authority, but also a younger voice that spoke of hope and redemption, rather than simple punishment and vengeance. The relationship that developed between Batman and Robin transcended the conventional boundaries of mentor and student to become something approaching the sacred bond between father and son, though neither participant would have used such language to describe their connection during those early years. The psychological healing that each provided to the other occurred gradually and largely unconsciously, as shared purpose and mutual dependence created foundations for trust and affection that helped repair some of the damage that tragedy had inflicted upon both their lives. The growth that Dick experienced during his years as Robin was not limited to physical development or technical skill acquisition, but encompassed the kind of moral and intellectual maturation that comes from being trusted with genuine responsibility while also being protected from the full weight of adult consequences. The balance that Bruce maintained between challenging his young partner and preserving his essential humanity required constant attention and adjustment as circumstances evolved and new threats emerged. The legacy that would eventually emerge from this unprecedented partnership extended far beyond the immediate impact of their individual actions to encompass a transformation in the very nature of heroism itself, proving that darkness could be balanced by light, that justice could be tempered by mercy, and that even the most tragic beginnings could be transformed into sources of hope and inspiration for generations of heroes yet to come. The transformation from child to young adult is never a simple journey, yet for those who have spent their formative years in the shadow of extraordinary purpose and dangerous responsibility, the passage becomes infinitely more complex and fraught with complications that ordinary adolescents could never comprehend. For Dick Grayson, the years between his early teens and his emergence as an independent hero were marked by a gradual awakening to truths that would fundamentally alter his relationship, not only with Batman, but with his own understanding of identity, purpose, and the meaning of family in its most unconventional forms. The Teen Titans emerged from the kind of cosmic accident that seemed to characterize so many pivotal moments in the lives of those chosen by destiny for heroic service. A threat that exceeded the capabilities of any single hero had drawn together young people from across the spectrum of superhuman experience, each bringing their own unique abilities and perspectives to a challenge that required not just power, but the kind of innovative thinking that came naturally to those who had not yet learned the limitations that experience supposedly imposed upon possibility. Robin's role in this unprecedented gathering was initially assumed rather than assigned, his experience as Batman's partner providing him with tactical knowledge and leadership skills that his age peers had not yet had the opportunity to develop. Yet what began as a temporary arrangement dictated by circumstance gradually evolved into something far more significant, as Dick discovered that his natural charisma and strategic thinking made him uniquely suited for coordinating the efforts of individuals whose personalities and powers might otherwise have made cooperation difficult if not impossible. The psychological freedom that Dick experienced while working with the Titans was unlike anything he had known during his years as Robin, providing him with his first taste of what it meant to make decisions without constant oversight, and to be valued for his own insights rather than simply his ability to execute someone else's plans. The other Titans looked to him not because he was Batman's sidekick, but because he possessed qualities of leadership and judgment that commanded respect independent of any reflected authority or borrowed credibility. The friendships that developed within the Titans represented Dick's first meaningful relationships with peers who shared similar experiences of extraordinary responsibility, and the isolation that inevitably accompanied abilities that set them apart from normal society. With Starfire, he discovered the possibility of romantic connection with someone who could understand the demands of heroic service without requiring explanations or apologies for the choices that such service necessitated. With the other team members, he found the kind of camaraderie and mutual support that had been absent from his relationship with Batman, no matter how deep their father-son bond might have grown. The success of the Titans as both a superhero team and a support network for young people struggling with the burdens of extraordinary power, demonstrated that Dick's leadership abilities extended far beyond mere tactical coordination, to encompass the more subtle skills of building consensus, managing diverse personalities, and creating environments where individual strengths could be maximized while personal weaknesses were supported and protected. These experiences provided him with confidence in his own judgment and capabilities that gradually reduced his psychological dependence upon Batman's guidance and approval. The growing tension between Dick's commitments to the Titans and his responsibilities as Robin created a dynamic that Bruce Wayne had never anticipated when he first offered the young circus orphan the opportunity to join his war. Crime, the child who had once been grateful for any chance to honor his parents' memory through service to justice, had evolved into a young man whose vision of heroism extended beyond Gotham's borders, and whose understanding of leadership encompassed possibilities that Batman's solitary methodology could not accommodate. The philosophical differences that emerged between mentor and student were subtle at first, manifesting in disagreements about tactics and priorities rather than fundamental questions about justice and morality. Yet these surface conflicts reflected deeper issues about autonomy, respect, and the natural human need to define oneself through choices and achievements that belong to no one else. Dick's increasing assertiveness and willingness to challenge Batman's decisions represented not rebellion for its own sake, but the healthy development of an independent moral compass that had been shaped by, but was no longer, subordinate to his mentor's worldview. The incident that would ultimately crystallize these tensions and force both Bruce and Dick to confront the changing nature of their relationship occurred during what should have been a routine confrontation with one of Gotham's recurring threats. The Joker's latest scheme had been detected and neutralized through the kind of careful planning and precise execution that had become standard procedure for the dynamic duo. Yet the criminal's unpredictability and sadistic creativity had introduced an element of chaos that transformed apparent victory into near tragedy. The bullet that struck Dick in the shoulder was fired from a weapon that should have been secured, a reminder that even the most thorough preparations could not account for every variable in situations involving individuals whose mental instability made their actions fundamentally unpredictable. The wound itself was not life-threatening, yet its psychological impact on both Dick and Bruce was profound, forcing them to confront the reality that the partnership they had built was placing a young person in danger that might ultimately prove fatal. Bruce's reaction to seeing his protege injured was immediate and overwhelming, triggering protective instincts that had been building for years beneath his carefully maintained exterior of professional detachment. The possibility of losing Dick to the same kind of senseless violence that had claimed his own parents activated fears that he had never fully acknowledged, revealing depths of emotional investment that transformed their professional relationship into something far more personal, and therefore far more vulnerable to the kinds of conflicts that could destroy it. The conversation that followed Dick's recovery from his injury was conducted with the kind of careful restraint that characterized all of their most important discussions. Yet beneath the surface, diplomacy lay currents of emotion and assumption that neither participant fully understood or was prepared to address directly. Bruce's suggestion that Dick might consider reducing his active involvement in crime fighting was presented as a reasonable response to legitimate safety concerns, yet Dick interpreted it as evidence that his mentor viewed him as fundamentally expendable rather than as an irreplaceable partner. The realization that he had outgrown his role as Batman's junior partner came to Dick not through dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of experiences and insights that made his current situation feel increasingly constraining and unsustainable. The teenager, who had once been grateful for any opportunity to contribute to the cause of justice, had evolved into a young man whose capabilities and understanding demanded a more substantial role in determining how that justice would be pursued and implemented. The decision to step back from his responsibilities as Robin was not made lightly or in anger, but rather from Dick's recognition that continuing in his current role would ultimately serve no one's interests, including those of the mission that had brought them together in the first place. His effectiveness as a crime fighter had always depended upon his enthusiasm and commitment, qualities that were being gradually eroded by frustration, and the growing sense that his contributions were being taken for granted rather than valued and respected. Bruce's response to Dick's announcement of his intention to reduce his involvement with Batman's mission was complex and contradictory, reflecting the collision between his rational understanding of the situation and his emotional investment in maintaining a partnership that had become central to his own psychological well-being. The practical part of his mind recognized that Dick had indeed outgrown the Robin role and deserved the opportunity to pursue his own vision of heroism. Yet the father figure within him recoiled from the prospect of losing someone who had become essential to his sense of purpose and meaning. The ultimatum that Bruce delivered in response to Dick's desire for greater independence was born from hurt and fear rather than tactical consideration or strategic thinking, yet its impact was immediate and devastating to their relationship. The suggestion that Dick must choose between complete commitment to Batman's mission and abandonment of the Robin identity entirely transformed what should have been a negotiation between partners into a confrontation between opponents, eliminating the possibility of compromise or gradual transition. Dick's feeling of betrayal and abandonment in the wake of this confrontation was compounded by his recognition that the man he had viewed as a father figure was apparently unwilling to accept his growth and development as natural and healthy, rather than as a threat to be contained or eliminated. The hurt that he experienced was not merely professional disappointment, but something far more personal and profound, touching on fundamental questions about love, loyalty, and the nature of family relationships that transcended simple agreements about crime-fighting methodology. The period of estrangement that followed was characterized by the kind of painful silence that occurs when people who care deeply about each other lack the emotional vocabulary necessary to express their feelings without causing additional hurt and misunderstanding. Neither Bruce nor Dick possessed the communication skills or psychological insight required to navigate the transition from mentor-student to peer relationship, leaving both of them isolated and confused about how to proceed. The decision to seek advice from Superman represented Dick's recognition that his situation required outside perspective from someone who could understand both the unique challenges of heroic service and the complex dynamics of relationships between individuals with extraordinary capabilities. Clark Kent's experience as someone who had maintained his essential humanity despite possessing godlike power made him uniquely qualified to offer guidance about balancing personal needs with responsibilities to others. The story that Superman shared about Nightwing of Krypton was more than simply historical information about his lost homeworld. It was a carefully chosen parable about identity, independence, and the courage required to step away from familiar roles in order to embrace new possibilities for growth and service. The ancient Kryptonian hero's willingness to sacrifice his family connections in order to pursue his vision of justice provided Dick with a model for understanding his own situation and the choices that lay before him. The symbolism inherent in the Nightwing name resonated with Dick on multiple levels, connecting his decision to leave the Robin identity with broader themes about maturation, transformation, and the natural progression from protected to protector that characterized all healthy development. The bird that emerged from its egg was no longer dependent upon its parents for survival, yet it carried forward the essential lessons and values that had shaped its earliest development creating continuity within change, rather than simple abandonment of the past. The creation of the Nightwing identity required more than simply adopting a new name and costume. It demanded a fundamental reimagining of Dick's relationship with heroism itself and his understanding of what it meant to serve justice without subordinating his own judgment and moral reasoning to someone else's vision and methodology. The transition from sidekick to independent hero was both liberation and burden, providing unprecedented freedom while also requiring acceptance of complete responsibility for the consequences of his choices. The first missions that Dick undertook as Nightwing were characterized by a mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty, as he discovered both the possibilities and the challenges that came with operating without Batman's guidance and support. The criminals who encountered this new presence in the shadows found themselves facing someone who combined Robin's tactical training with a more mature understanding of psychology and motivation, creating an opponent who was both familiar and mysteriously different from the junior partner they had previously dismissed as secondary threat. The relationship between Dick and the other Titans was transformed by his transition to independent hero status, as his leadership of the team became official rather than informal, and his strategic decisions were no longer subject to external review or potential override by Batman's authority. The enhanced trust and responsibility that his teammates placed in him reflected their recognition that he had evolved from promising apprentice to fully capable peer, someone whose judgment could be relied upon in the most dangerous and complex situations. The psychological impact of leaving the Robin identity behind was more profound and long-lasting than Dick had anticipated, involving not just practical adjustments to new methods and responsibilities, but also deeper questions about identity and the relationship between past and future that had implications extending far beyond his career as a crime fighter. The young man who had defined himself for years through his connection to Batman now faced the challenge of discovering who he might become when that defining relationship was fundamentally altered. The loneliness that Dick experienced during the early months of his independence was offset partially by his work with the Titans and his growing relationship with Starfire, yet neither of these connections could completely fill the void left by the estrangement from the man who had been father, mentor, and partner for most of his conscious life. The recognition that he missed Bruce's presence and guidance, even while celebrating his freedom from Batman's control, created an emotional complexity that would influence his choices and relationships for years to come. The gradual healing of the rift between Dick and Bruce began not through dramatic gestures or explicit apologies, but through the kind of patient work that characterized all meaningful reconciliation between people who had hurt each other, through misunderstanding and inability to communicate effectively about their deepest needs and fears. The process required both men to acknowledge their own contributions to the conflict, while also accepting that their relationship would never return to its previous configuration, but might evolve into something equally valuable, though fundamentally different. The realization that Nightwing had successfully established himself as an independent hero, worthy of respect and recognition within the broader superhero community, provided Bruce with evidence that his training and mentorship had achieved their ultimate purpose, preparing Dick not just to be an effective crime fighter, but to become a leader capable of inspiring and coordinating others in service of justice. The pride that Bruce felt in Dick's achievements was tempered by the recognition that success necessarily meant the end of their original partnership, yet it also opened possibilities for new forms of collaboration between equals, rather than mentor and student. The legacy of Dick's transition from Robin to Nightwing extended far beyond the immediate impact on his relationship with Batman to encompass broader questions about growth, independence, and the natural evolution of all healthy relationships between people who care about each other. The courage that he displayed in choosing his own path, despite the emotional costs involved, became a model for future generations of young heroes who would face similar challenges in balancing personal development with loyalty to mentors and commitment to shared missions. The transformation was complete when Dick finally understood that becoming Nightwing had not represented abandonment of everything that Robin had meant, but rather the fulfillment of the promise that the Robin identity had always contained. The recognition that the boy who had sought to honor his parents' memory through service to justice had grown into a man capable of serving that same cause through his own vision and methodology, while carrying forward the essential values that had shaped his earliest understanding of what it meant to be a hero. In the forgotten corners of every great city, there exist neighborhoods where hope goes to die. Places where the American dream has curdled into something bitter and unrecognizable, where children learn survival skills that should be unnecessary in any civilized society. Crime Alley in Gotham City was perhaps the most notorious of these urban wastelands, a collection of narrow streets and crumbling tenements where poverty and desperation had created conditions that seemed designed to crush the human spirit and transform innocent souls into predators or prey. It was into this harsh landscape that Jason Peter Todd was born, the son of Willis and Catherine Todd, two individuals whose own stories of disappointment and compromise had prepared them poorly for the responsibilities of parenthood, yet who nevertheless brought a child into existence during a moment of hope that circumstances would soon prove to be tragically misplaced. The world that awaited their son was one where survival required skills that no parent should have to teach, and where the normal markers of childhood development were replaced by lessons in avoiding danger and finding sustenance through whatever means proved necessary. Willis Todd was a man whose criminal career had been shaped more by desperation than ambition, a small-time operator who specialized in schemes that promised quick returns with minimal risk, yet somehow always seemed to result in complications that left him worse off than before. His criminal activities were not the product of some grand antisocial vision, but rather the inevitable result of limited options and poor decision-making skills, creating a cycle of petty crime and periodic imprisonment that provided neither stability for his family nor satisfaction for his own frustrated ambitions. The relationship between Willis and Catherine was characterized by the kind of mutual dependence that develops between people who have few other options and limited prospects for improvement, a bond forged not through shared dreams or compatible personalities, but through the simple recognition that they were both too damaged and too isolated to expect better treatment from anyone else. Their marriage, such as it was, provided neither the emotional support nor the practical stability that might have given their child the foundation necessary for healthy development. Catherine Todd's struggle with addiction began as an attempt to self-medicate the depression and anxiety that came from living in circumstances that offered little hope for meaningful change or improvement. Yet it gradually evolved into something that consumed increasing amounts of her attention and resources while providing diminishing returns in terms of actual relief from her psychological suffering. Her dependence upon various substances created an additional layer of instability in a household that was already struggling with poverty and the constant threat of Willis's criminal activities drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement. The environment in which Jason spent his earliest years was one where normal childhood activities like play and education took second place to more immediate concerns about safety and survival, where the development of trust and security that should characterize early psychological formation was replaced by wariness and self-reliance that no child should be required to cultivate. The skills he learned during this period would serve him well in his later career as a crime fighter, yet they came at a cost to his emotional development that would influence his relationships and decision-making throughout his adult life. The absence of Willis Todd from his son's life began with a prison sentence for his latest criminal venture, yet it became permanent when he made the decision not to return to his family upon his release, choosing instead to pursue opportunities elsewhere that he convinced himself would eventually allow him to provide better support from a distance than he could manage through direct involvement in their daily struggles. This abandonment was experienced by young Jason as both liberation and loss, freeing him from the constant tension that surrounded his father's presence, while also eliminating whatever minimal stability Willis's occasional legitimate employment had provided. Catherine's deterioration following her husband's departure accelerated as the stresses of single parenthood, combined with her existing substance abuse issues, to create a downward spiral that she lacked the resources and support necessary to arrest or reverse. Her increasing inability to function as a parent forced Jason to assume responsibilities that should have been handled by adults, transforming him from child to caregiver at an age when he should have been focused on school and friendships and the normal developmental tasks of his age group. The death of Catherine Todd was both sudden and inevitable, the final result of years of abuse to a body and mind that had reached the limits of their ability to sustain the damage that addiction and poverty had inflicted upon them. Jason's discovery of his mother's lifeless form was a trauma that would shape his understanding of mortality and loss for the remainder of his existence, teaching him at a tragically young age that death was not some distant abstraction but an immediate reality that could claim anyone at any time without regard for their hopes or plans or the needs of those who depended upon them. The period of complete independence that followed his mother's death was characterized by the kind of resourcefulness and determination that emerges when survival becomes the primary focus of daily existence, requiring Jason to develop skills and knowledge that most children his age could not even imagine needing. The transformation from grieving son to self-sufficient street orphan required psychological adaptations that protected him from despair, while also building walls around his emotions that would prove difficult to dismantle even when safer circumstances eventually presented themselves. The methods that Jason employed to sustain himself were dictated by necessity rather than choice, involving activities that operated in the grey areas between legal and illegal behavior, while avoiding the kinds of serious crimes that might have attracted official attention or led to his placement in institutional care that he had learned to view with suspicion and distrust. His specialization in automotive parts theft was chosen for its relative safety and the ready market that existed for such merchandise among the many residents of Crime Alley who possessed mechanical skills but lacked legitimate access to replacement components for their vehicles. The night that Jason first encountered the Batmobile represented a convergence of circumstance and opportunity that would transform not only his own life, but also the trajectory of Batman's mission in ways that neither participant could have anticipated at the time. The sight of the legendary vehicle sitting apparently unguarded in a dark alley was too tempting for a young man whose survival had long depended upon his ability to recognize and exploit such opportunities. Yet it also represented a level of risk that exceeded anything in his previous criminal experience. The decision to attempt theft of the Batmobile's tires was made with the kind of calculated audacity that had allowed Jason to survive on the streets for months, combining careful observation of his surroundings with quick execution designed to minimize exposure to potential detection or pursuit. Yet the precision and efficiency that had served him well in previous endeavors proved inadequate when applied to the property of someone whose resources and capabilities far exceeded those of normal law enforcement or private security. Batman's reaction to discovering the young thief attempting to steal from his vehicle was initially one of professional annoyance rather than personal outrage, yet his closer examination of Jason's circumstances and methodology revealed qualities that suggested potential worth exploring rather than simply punishing. The courage required to attempt such a brazen theft, the technical skills necessary to begin removing tires efficiently, and most importantly, the obvious desperation that would drive someone to take such risks, all combined to create a situation that demanded investigation rather than immediate apprehension. The conversation that took place between Batman and Jason during their first encounter was conducted in the shorthand of the streets, where direct questions were answered with evasive responses, and where trust was earned through actions rather than words. Batman's ability to recognize the signs of genuine need beneath Jason's carefully constructed facade of toughness and self-sufficiency demonstrated the detective skills that made him effective at understanding criminal behavior, while Jason's grudging respect for someone who had managed to approach him without triggering his well-developed survival instincts suggested that he retained the capacity for normal human relationships despite his traumatic experiences. The decision to place Jason in the school for troubled youth represented Batman's initial attempt to address the young thief's situation through conventional means, operating on the assumption that institutional care and structured education might provide the stability and guidance necessary to redirect his obviously considerable capabilities toward legitimate pursuits. This approach reflected Bruce Wayne's confidence in established social systems and his preference for working within existing frameworks whenever possible, rather than taking personal responsibility for problems that might be handled through proper channels. The revelation that the school was actually operating as a training ground for young criminals, rather than a rehabilitation facility, demonstrated once again that Gotham's corruption extended into areas where it should never have been tolerated, transforming institutions designed to help vulnerable youth into mechanisms for perpetuating the very cycles of crime and exploitation that had created their problems in the first place. Jason's situation at the school provided him with a comprehensive education in criminal methodology, while also confirming his existing suspicions about the reliability of adult authority figures and institutional promises of assistance. Batman's decision to retrieve Jason from the school and offer him an alternative path represented a significant departure from his normal operating procedures, reflecting both his growing understanding of the young man's potential and his recognition that conventional solutions were inadequate for addressing problems that had been created by the failure of conventional institutions. The offer of training and partnership was made not from sentiment or impulse, but from careful analysis of Jason's capabilities and the strategic advantages that might be gained from channeling his skills toward constructive purposes. The training program that Batman designed for Jason was necessarily different from the one that had prepared Dick Grayson for his role as Robin, taking into account both Jason's different background and skill set, and the lessons that had been learned from the previous partnership about the challenges and responsibilities of working with a young partner. The emphasis placed on discipline and control reflected Batman's understanding that Jason's street-learned survival instincts, while valuable in many situations, needed to be refined and redirected to be compatible with the moral constraints that governed heroic action. Jason's natural aptitude for the physical aspects of crime fighting was evident from his earliest training sessions, as the strength and agility that had been developed through years of dangerous street life translated readily into martial arts and acrobatic skills that complemented Batman's own capabilities. His familiarity with criminal thinking and street-level operations provided insights that even Batman's extensive experience had not fully prepared him to understand, making him a valuable source of intelligence about the methods and motivations of the kind of criminals who operated in Gotham's poorest neighborhoods. The psychological profile that emerged during Jason's training revealed a young man whose traumatic experiences had created both strengths and vulnerabilities that would influence his effectiveness as a crime fighter in ways that were not always predictable or easy to manage. His fearlessness in dangerous situations reflected genuine courage, but also a disturbing indifference to personal safety that suggested incomplete processing of his earlier traumas. While his loyalty to those who had earned his trust was absolute, but his tolerance for perceived betrayal was virtually non-existent. The official debut of the second Robin was marked by careful preparation, designed to minimize the inevitable comparisons with his predecessor, while also establishing Jason's own identity and approach to the role that had been created, specifically for Dick Grayson's very different personality and skill set. The costume and equipment that were prepared for Jason incorporated modifications that took advantage of his particular strengths, while also providing additional protection and support in areas where his experience was more limited than Dick's had been at the same stage of development. The first mission that Batman and the new Robin undertook together was chosen specifically to test Jason's ability to function effectively under the pressures of real combat, while also providing opportunities for him to demonstrate the street knowledge and practical skills that distinguished him from his predecessor. The success of this initial outing provided both partners with confidence that their collaboration could be effective, yet it also revealed subtle differences in approach and philosophy that would become more significant as their partnership developed and matured. The discovery that Jason's father had been murdered by Two-Face added a personal dimension to their crime-fighting mission that paralleled Batman's own origin story, while also creating potential complications that required careful management to prevent the young Robin from being consumed by the desire for revenge that had nearly destroyed Bruce Wayne's effectiveness during his early years as a vigilante. The revelation of Willis Todd's fate forced Jason to confront questions about family, loyalty, and justice that had no easy answers, and that would continue to influence his worldview throughout his heroic career. The confrontation with Two-Face that resulted from this discovery provided Jason with his first opportunity to demonstrate that he could rise above the desire for personal vengeance that his background might have been expected to produce, showing instead the kind of moral restraint and commitment to due process that Batman had hoped his training would instill. The decision to allow Harvey Dent to be arrested rather than killed represented a crucial test of Jason's character and his understanding of the principles that separated heroes from vigilantes, marking his successful transition from street survivor to legitimate crime fighter. Yet beneath the surface of these early successes lay psychological currents and unresolved conflicts that would eventually create serious problems for both Jason and Batman. As the young Robin's harsh upbringing and exposure to the worst aspects of human nature had created moral frameworks and emotional responses that were not entirely compatible with the idealistic vision of justice that Batman sought to embody. The street ethics that had allowed Jason to survive in Crime Alley were based on pragmatic calculations about immediate threats and opportunities, rather than abstract principles about the sanctity of life and the importance of due process, creating potential conflicts that would require ongoing attention and careful management. The relationship that developed between Batman and Jason was complicated by the obvious differences in their backgrounds and the challenges involved in adapting training methods that had been successful with Dick Grayson to work with, someone whose formative experiences had been radically different. The mentorship dynamic that had felt natural with Dick required constant adjustment and renegotiation with Jason, as his fierce independence and suspicion of authority made him resistant to instruction that he perceived as condescending or controlling, while his loyalty and gratitude toward Bruce made him eager to prove himself worthy of the trust and opportunity he had been given. The gradual emergence of philosophical differences between Batman and Robin became apparent through their responses to various criminal threats and moral dilemmas that tested their shared commitment to justice, while also revealing the different ways that their backgrounds had shaped their understanding of what justice actually meant in practical terms. Jason's willingness to use force that exceeded Batman's comfort level reflected not sadistic tendencies or lack of moral development, but rather a more pragmatic approach to threat assessment that had been shaped by years of experience with genuine danger, and the recognition that restraint was sometimes interpreted as weakness by criminals who respected only strength. The tension between these different approaches to crime fighting created ongoing challenges for their partnership that required constant communication and negotiation to manage effectively, as both participants struggled to balance their respect for each other with their commitment to their own moral principles and understanding of what heroic action demanded in specific situations. The success of their collaboration depended upon their ability to find common ground between Batman's idealistic vision and Jason's pragmatic realism, creating synthesis that honored both perspectives while remaining true to the fundamental mission that had brought them together. The search for one's origins is perhaps the most fundamental human quest, driven by the deep psychological need to understand the circumstances of our creation and the forces that shaped our earliest development. Yet for those whose beginnings were marked by tragedy and abandonment, this journey towards self-knowledge can become a dangerous obsession that leads not to healing, but to further trauma and destruction. Jason Todd's discovery that the woman he had believed to be his mother was not his biological parent opened wounds that had never properly healed, while simultaneously offering the tantalizing possibility that somewhere in the world existed someone who might provide answers to questions about identity and belonging that had haunted him since childhood. The investigation that Jason undertook to discover the truth about his parentage was conducted with the same methodical thoroughness that Batman had taught him to apply to all detective work, yet it was also driven by emotional needs and desperate hopes that compromised his objectivity and made him vulnerable to manipulation by those who might seek to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities. The leads that he followed took him across continents and through databases that revealed the complex web of relationships and circumstances that had surrounded his birth, creating a picture of his origins that was far more complicated and morally ambiguous than the simple narrative of abandonment and neglect that he had constructed to explain his early experiences. The revelation that his biological mother was still alive came as a shock that disrupted every assumption Jason had made about his past and his place in the world, replacing the certainty of loss with the possibility of connection, while also raising questions about why she had chosen to remain absent from his life during the years when her presence might have made the difference between survival, destruction. The knowledge that Sheila Haywood had gone on to build a successful career as an aid worker in some of the world's most dangerous regions suggested that her absence from his life had not been due to indifference or inability, but rather to choices and circumstances that he could not yet understand. The decision to travel to Ethiopia in search of his mother was made against Batman's advice and without his knowledge, reflecting Jason's growing need to assert his independence and make decisions based on his own judgment, rather than deferring to authority figures who, however well-intentioned, could not fully understand the emotional urgency that drove his quest for truth and connection. The journey itself was fraught with practical dangers that extended far beyond the personal risks involved in confronting painful family history, as the region was experiencing the kind of political instability and humanitarian crisis that made travel hazardous, even for experienced aid workers and journalists. The reunion between Jason and Sheila was marked by the complex mixture of joy, confusion, and underlying tension that characterizes most attempts to rebuild relationships that have been severed by years of separation and mutual ignorance about each other's experiences and development. The young woman who had given birth to Jason in desperation and poverty had evolved into a competent professional whose work saving lives in crisis situations seemed to validate the moral principles that Batman had sought to instill in his protégé. Yet beneath the surface of her apparent altruism lay secrets and compromises that would soon prove to be more dangerous than Jason could have imagined. The discovery that Sheila was being blackmailed by the Joker represented a convergence of Jason's personal quest with the larger mission that had brought him into Batman's world, transforming what had begun as a private family matter into a confrontation with one of the most dangerous criminals in Gotham's rogues gallery. The revelation that his mother had been systematically stealing medical supplies and equipment that were desperately needed by refugee populations in order to satisfy the Joker's demands created moral complexities that challenged Jason's understanding of right and wrong, while also placing him in immediate physical danger. The psychological impact of learning that his biological mother was not the heroic figure he had hoped to find, but rather someone whose weaknesses and poor choices had made her vulnerable to criminal exploitation, was devastating to Jason's sense of identity and belonging, confirming his worst fears about the reasons for his abandonment, while also forcing him to confront the possibility that the criminal tendencies he had struggled to overcome might be inherited rather than simply the result of environmental circumstances. The knowledge that she had chosen to cooperate with the Joker rather than seek help from legitimate authorities suggested a moral flexibility that reminded him uncomfortably of his own willingness to bend rules when circumstances seemed to justify such compromises. The confrontation between Robin and the Joker that resulted from these revelations was unlike any previous encounter between the young hero and Gotham's most notorious criminal, charged with personal animosity and emotional stakes that went far beyond the usual conflict between order and chaos that characterized most superhero battles. The Joker's awareness of Jason's emotional vulnerability and his sadistic pleasure in exploiting psychological weaknesses made him a particularly dangerous opponent for someone whose judgment was already compromised by the trauma of family betrayal and the desperate need to prove himself worthy of the heroic identity he had adopted. The betrayal that Sheila committed when she revealed Jason's presence to the Joker was motivated not by malice, but by the kind of desperate calculation that characterizes people who have been pushed beyond their emotional and moral limits by circumstances beyond their control, yet its impact on Jason was no less devastating for being understandable. The realization that his own mother had chosen to sacrifice his safety in order to protect herself from the consequences of her previous compromises represented the final collapse of his hopes for family connection and belonging, leaving him more isolated and psychologically vulnerable than he had been even during his darkest days on the streets of Crime Alley. The torture that the Joker inflicted upon Jason was designed not merely to cause physical pain, but to break his spirit and destroy his sense of identity as a hero, using psychological manipulation and systematic humiliation to convince him that his attempts to fight crime and protect the innocent were futile gestures that would inevitably end in failure and death. The crowbar that became the instrument of Jason's destruction was chosen for its symbolic significance as much as its practical effectiveness, representing the kind of brutal simplicity that characterized street violence, while also serving as a reminder of the vulnerability that no amount of training or protective equipment could completely eliminate. The methodical nature of the assault reflected the Joker's understanding of how to inflict maximum trauma while prolonging his victim's suffering, using techniques that had been refined through years of experience with torture and psychological warfare to create damage that extended far beyond the immediate physical injuries. The laughter that accompanied each blow served multiple purposes, providing the Joker with sadistic pleasure while also creating an atmosphere of surreal horror that made Jason's situation feel like a nightmare from which awakening might be impossible. The conversation that took place between the Joker and Jason during the torture session revealed the criminal's philosophical justification for his actions, his belief that life was fundamentally meaningless, and that the moral principles that guided heroic action were simply elaborate self-deceptions that reality would inevitably expose as false and naive. The attempts to convince Jason that Batman would never arrive in time to save him were designed to destroy his faith in the partnership and mentorship that had given his life meaning and direction, replacing hope with despair and trust with cynicism. Jason's resistance to this psychological assault demonstrated the strength of character that had allowed him to survive on the streets and excel as Robin, yet it also revealed the limitations of human endurance when faced with systematic torture conducted by someone whose understanding of pain and fear exceeded that of most criminals. The physical injuries that accumulated during the beating were severe enough to threaten his life even without the additional danger posed by the explosive device that the Joker had prepared as the culmination of his sadistic entertainment. The bomb that was planted in the warehouse represented the Joker's ultimate expression of contempt for human life and his desire to create destruction that would serve no purpose beyond the satisfaction of his own twisted sense of humor. Yet it also provided Jason with a final opportunity to demonstrate the heroic qualities that had made him worthy of the Robin mantle despite his unconventional background and the challenges involved in his training and development. The time limit imposed by the ticking device created urgency that focused his remaining strength and determination, while also making clear that any rescue attempt would require extraordinary effort and considerable risk. The efforts that Jason made to free himself and Sheila from their restraints were hampered by his injuries and the limited time available, yet they also demonstrated his refusal to surrender to despair, even when faced with apparently impossible odds. The techniques that he employed drew upon both his formal training under Batman and the survival skills that he had learned during his years on the street, combining analytical problem-solving with desperate improvisation in ways that might have succeeded under different circumstances. The decision to shield his mother with his own body when escape proved impossible represented the ultimate expression of Jason's moral development and his commitment to the principles that Batman had sought to instill in him, demonstrating that his capacity for heroic self-sacrifice had survived the trauma of betrayal and torture to emerge when it mattered most. The choice to protect someone who had betrayed him rather than attempting to maximize his own chances of survival revealed depths of character that contradicted the Joker's cynical assertions about human nature and the futility of moral action. The explosion that ended Jason's life was both instantaneous and eternal, a moment of destruction that consumed not only his physical form, but also the hopes and dreams that had sustained him through years of hardship and struggle, while marking the end of a story that had begun with such promise and potential for redemption. The force of the blast was sufficient to ensure that death came quickly, sparing him the prolonged suffering that might have accompanied survival with catastrophic injuries, yet providing no comfort to those who would discover the aftermath and struggle to understand how such tragedy could have been allowed to occur. Batman's arrival at the scene moments after the explosion represented one of the greatest failures in his career as a protector and mentor, the kind of devastating miscalculation that would haunt him for the remainder of his crime-fighting career, while also forcing him to confront fundamental questions about the morality of involving children in dangerous missions. regardless of their apparent readiness and willingness to accept such risks. The sight of Jason's broken body amid the rubble and debris created trauma that would influence every subsequent decision about partnerships and protégés, making him more cautious and protective, while also more isolated and reluctant to trust others with important responsibilities. The funeral that followed was conducted with the kind of quiet dignity that Jason would have appreciated, avoiding the public spectacle that might have compromised operational security, while also honoring his sacrifice and the contributions he had made to the cause of justice during his brief but significant career as Robin. The attendance was limited to those who had known him personally and understood the full scope of his transformation from street criminal to heroic partner, creating an atmosphere of genuine grief and loss rather than political theatre or media manipulation. The memorial that was established in the Batcave served multiple purposes beyond simple commemoration, providing Batman with a constant reminder of the costs involved in his mission, while also preserving Jason's costume and equipment as symbols of both achievement and tragedy that would influence future decisions about recruitment and training. The placement of the display case in a prominent location ensured that no one who entered the Batcave could ignore the implications of Jason's death or forget the human price that had been paid for whatever victories had been achieved in the ongoing war against crime. The psychological impact of losing Jason extended throughout the entire network of heroes and allies who had known him and worked alongside him during his career as Robin, creating ripples of grief and self-doubt that affected their own effectiveness and commitment to the shared mission that had brought them together. The questions raised by his death about the ethics of child soldiers and the responsibility of adult mentors for the safety of their protégés would continue to influence superhero community dynamics for years to come. The years that followed Jason's death were marked by Batman's gradual descent into the kind of obsessive isolation that had characterized his earliest years as a vigilante, before the partnership with Dick Grayson had taught him the value of collaboration and the healing power of shared purpose and mutual support. The guilt and self-recrimination that consumed him made him more aggressive and less forgiving in his treatment of criminals, while also more distant and difficult to work with for his remaining allies and associates. The resurrection that would eventually return Jason to life was accomplished through mechanisms that operated outside normal understanding of biology and physics, involving cosmic forces and reality-altering events that had implications extending far beyond individual mortality to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of existence and the possibility of redemption through supernatural intervention. The process by which his consciousness was restored was gradual and incomplete, leaving him with memories and personality traits that were recognizably his own, while also introducing changes that reflected the trauma of death and the corrupting influence of the methods employed in his revival. The discovery that he had been returned to life without Batman's knowledge or involvement added additional layers of betrayal and abandonment to Jason's psychological profile, confirming his worst suspicions about his expendability and the priorities that governed his former mentor's decision-making processes. The realization that Bruce had apparently accepted his death as final and had not pursued every possible avenue for restoration created resentment that would influence all their future interactions and make reconciliation far more difficult to achieve. The Lazarus pit that completed Jason's physical restoration also affected his mental and emotional state in ways that amplified his anger, while reducing his capacity for forgiveness and understanding, transforming justified grievances into consuming hatred that threatened to destroy any possibility of returning to the heroic path that had once defined his identity and purpose. The chemical changes produced by the mystical waters interacted with his existing psychological trauma to create a personality that retained Jason's memories and capabilities, while also incorporating elements of darkness and violence that had not been present during his original lifetime. The adoption of the Red Hood identity represented Jason's conscious rejection of everything that the Robin mantle had symbolized, choosing instead a name and costume that connected him to one of the Joker's earliest and most notorious aliases, while also serving notice that his approach to crime fighting would no longer be constrained by the moral limitations that had ultimately contributed to his death. The transformation from symbol of hope to agent of vengeance marked the completion of his corruption and the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing tragedy that his story had become. The war that Red Hood began upon his return to Gotham was aimed not only at the criminal organizations that had contributed to the city's problems, but also at the hero who had failed to save him, and the system of justice that had proven inadequate to address the root causes of the suffering that had shaped his entire existence. The methods he employed were designed to be both effective in achieving immediate results and provocative in challenging the assumptions that guided Batman's approach to crime fighting, forcing confrontations that would test the strength of principles that Jason now viewed as naive and ultimately counterproductive. The ultimate confrontation between Red Hood and Batman was inevitable from the moment of Jason's return, representing not just a conflict between former allies, but a fundamental disagreement about the nature of justice and the appropriate responses to evil that could only be resolved through direct confrontation and the application of force. The psychological warfare that preceded their physical battle was designed to maximize the emotional impact on both participants, ensuring that their conflict would be remembered and understood as a defining moment in the evolution of Batman's mission and methodology. In the privileged enclaves of Gotham City, where wealth and status provided insulation from the harsh realities that shaped the lives of those less fortunate, there existed families whose children grew up surrounded by opportunity and comfort, yet who sometimes developed interests and obsessions that set them apart from their peers in ways that foreshadowed extraordinary destinies. The Drake family represented the pinnacle of Gotham's social hierarchy, their fortune built upon generations of successful business ventures and strategic investments that had weathered economic upheavals and social changes, while continuing to generate the kind of wealth that opened doors and created possibilities that most people could never imagine accessing. Timothy Jackson Drake was born into circumstances that should have guaranteed a life of ease and conventional achievement, surrounded by the kind of educational opportunities and cultural advantages that typically produced successful professionals, philanthropists, or perhaps politicians who viewed public service as a natural extension of their privileged upbringing. Yet from his earliest years, Tim displayed an intellectual curiosity and analytical intensity that exceeded the normal range of childhood interests, demonstrating the kind of focused attention and systematic thinking that would eventually draw him into the world of mystery and detection that operated in Gotham's shadows. The photographic memory that Tim possessed was not merely an unusual talent, but a comprehensive cognitive enhancement that allowed him to retain and organize vast amounts of information with perfect accuracy, creating an internal database of facts, observations, and connections that grew more valuable and sophisticated with each passing year. This remarkable ability was complemented by an intuitive understanding of patterns and relationships that enabled him to draw conclusions and make predictions that often surprised adults who had access to more experience but less natural analytical capability. The Drake family's social position provided Tim with access to events and gatherings where Gotham's most prominent citizens interacted in relatively informal settings, creating opportunities for observation and study that would prove invaluable in his later career as a detective and crime fighter. The charity galas, cultural events, and business functions that his parents attended offered him glimpses into the complex web of relationships and influences that shaped the city's political and economic landscape, while also providing him with early exposure to individuals who would later prove significant in his heroic development. The circus performance that would change the trajectory of Tim's entire existence was attended by the Drake family as part of their regular participation in Gotham's cultural life, an evening of entertainment that was expected to provide pleasant distraction from business concerns, while also offering opportunities for social interaction with other members of their community. The Haley Circus represented a form of wholesome family entertainment that appealed to parents seeking appropriate activities for their children, while also satisfying adult desires for spectacle and artistry that transcended the mundane concerns of daily life. The meeting between young Tim and Dick Grayson before the tragic performance was brief but significant, creating a personal connection that would influence Tim's understanding of the events that followed, while also providing him with direct access to one of the principals in the drama that was about to unfold. Dick's natural charisma and genuine warmth made an impression on Tim that went beyond simple celebrity fascination to encompass something approaching friendship, despite the obvious differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. The tragedy that claimed the lives of John and Mary Grayson was witnessed by Tim from a perspective that differed significantly from that of most audience members, his analytical mind automatically recording details and observations that others missed while their attention was focused on the immediate horror of the accident itself. The systematic nature of his observation and the accuracy of his recall would prove crucial years later when he began to piece together the connections and patterns that revealed the true identities of Gotham's most famous crime fighters. The impact of witnessing such devastating loss at a young age was profound and lasting, creating in Tim an awareness of mortality and tragedy that most children his age were fortunate enough to avoid, while also demonstrating the fragility of the security and happiness that his privileged upbringing had led him to take for granted. The knowledge that even the most skilled and careful performers could be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control instilled in him a heightened appreciation for the courage required to take risks in service of others, and the massive importance of preparation and vigilance in dangerous situations. The adoption of Dick Grayson by Bruce Wayne was followed with intense interest by Tim, whose natural curiosity about the wealthy philanthropist had been heightened by his connection to the circus tragedy and his growing awareness of the mysterious circumstances that seemed to surround many of Wayne's public appearances and activities. The decision to take in an orphaned child was admirable from a humanitarian perspective, yet Tim's analytical mind detected subtle inconsistencies and unusual patterns that suggested more complex motivations and hidden agendas that might explain Wayne's seemingly impulsive act of charity. The years that followed were marked by Tim's systematic observation of both Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson, using his family's social connections and his own developing skills in research and investigation to gather information about their activities and relationships, while also beginning to form hypotheses about the nature of their connection and the reasons for their unusual behavior patterns. The transformation of Dick from traumatized orphan to confident young man was remarkable enough to attract attention, yet the specific ways in which his development proceeded suggested influences and training that went far beyond conventional education and therapy. The emergence of Batman and Robin as Gotham's most prominent crime-fighting partnership coincided with Tim's own development from curious child to serious student of detective work, creating opportunities for him to apply his analytical skills to real-world mysteries. while also providing him with subjects whose activities generated the kind of complex puzzles that challenged his intellectual abilities and satisfied his need for mental stimulation. The connection between the timing of these heroes' appearance and Dick Grayson's adoption was obvious enough to attract his attention, yet proving such a connection required careful observation and systematic analysis of available evidence. The footage of Batman and Robin in action that Tim studied, with obsessive intensity, revealed details and patterns that casual observers missed, his trained eye detecting subtle clues about fighting styles, physical capabilities, and tactical approaches that reflected specific types of training and background experience. The acrobatic abilities displayed by Robin were particularly significant, matching not only the general skill level of professional circus performers, but also the specific techniques and signature moves that had characterized the Flying Graysons' performances before their tragic deaths. The quadruple somersault that Robin performed during the confrontation with the Penguin was a maneuver so difficult and distinctive that it could serve as a definitive identifier, requiring not only exceptional physical ability but also the kind of specialized training that was available only to a select few performers worldwide. Tim's recognition of this technique as one that had been perfected by the Grayson family provided him with the crucial piece of evidence necessary to confirm his growing suspicions about Robin's true identity and, by extension, Batman's connection to Bruce Wayne. The logical deduction that followed this breakthrough was swift and comprehensive, as Tim's analytical mind processed the implications of Robin's identity and traced the connections that led inevitably to the conclusion that Bruce Wayne and Batman were the same person. The wealth necessary to fund such an elaborate crime-fighting operation, the resources required to develop advanced equipment and technology, the access needed to gather intelligence about criminal activities, all pointed towards someone with Wayne's capabilities and motivation, while the timing of Batman's emergence corresponded perfectly with the period following the murder of Wayne's parents that had provided him with both motive and opportunity to begin his vigilante career. The verification of these conclusions required additional investigation and observation, as Tim recognized that the stakes involved in being wrong about such matters could be catastrophic for all concerned parties, while also understanding that the knowledge he was acquiring carried with it responsibilities and dangers that he was not yet prepared to handle. The methods he employed to gather confirmation were necessarily indirect and subtle, designed to avoid detection, while also building a comprehensive case that could withstand scrutiny and challenge from skeptics who might question his conclusions. The obsession that developed during this period of investigation was both intellectually stimulating and emotionally isolating, as Tim found himself drawn deeper into a world of secrets and mysteries that he could not share with family or friends, while also discovering that his normal social relationships and academic pursuits felt increasingly trivial and unsatisfying compared to the excitement and importance of his detective work. The knowledge that he possessed about Gotham's greatest heroes created a sense of connection and purpose that was unlike anything he had previously experienced, yet it also placed him in a position of dangerous isolation and potential vulnerability. The transition from Dick Grayson to Jason Todd as Robin was observed and documented by Tim with the same systematic attention that he had applied to all aspects of the dynamic duo's activities, yet the obvious differences in personality, background, and approach between the two young heroes raised questions about Batman's methods and judgment that troubled Tim's idealistic vision of their mission and effectiveness. Jason's more aggressive style and apparent willingness to use excessive force suggested internal conflicts and philosophical disagreements that might eventually undermine the partnership's effectiveness and moral authority. The death of Jason Todd was a catastrophic event that shattered Tim's understanding of heroism and forced him to confront the real dangers and ultimate stakes involved in the war on crime that he had been observing from a safe distance as an intellectual exercise and source of entertainment. The knowledge that someone barely older than himself had been murdered while serving as Robin transformed his perspective on Batman's mission from romantic adventure to genuine tragedy, while also raising urgent questions about Batman's psychological state and future effectiveness as Gotham's protector. The changes in Batman's behavior following Jason's death were obvious to anyone who followed his activities closely. Yet Tim's systematic analysis and comprehensive knowledge of previous patterns made him uniquely qualified to understand the full scope of the psychological deterioration that was occurring and the potential consequences if such trends continued unchecked. The increased violence and decreased restraint that characterized Batman's recent activities suggested a spiral toward darkness that might ultimately transform Gotham's greatest protector into the kind of threat that he had originally emerged to combat. The decision to approach Nightwing with his concerns represented Tim's recognition that he possessed knowledge and insights that might be crucial for addressing a crisis that threatened not only Batman's effectiveness, but also the safety of Gotham's citizens and the moral integrity of the heroic mission that had inspired Tim's own development and aspirations. The courage required to make contact with someone whose secret identity he had deduced through unauthorized investigation was considerable, yet Tim's sense of responsibility and his growing understanding of the stakes involved overcame his natural caution and respect for privacy. The conversation with Dick Grayson confirmed many of Tim's analyses and conclusions, while also revealing the depth of concern that Batman's former partner felt about the psychological changes that had followed Jason's death. Yet Nightwing's reluctance to resume the Robin identity or return to active partnership with Batman created a dilemma that required alternative solutions and approaches. The suggestion that Tim himself might be qualified to serve as Robin was initially dismissed as impossible and inappropriate. Yet the logic of the proposal became increasingly compelling, as conventional alternatives proved inadequate or unavailable. The rescue of Batman and Nightwing from Two-Face's trap provided Tim with his first opportunity to demonstrate that his theoretical knowledge and analytical skills could be successfully applied to real-world crisis situations, while also proving that he possessed the courage and practical capability necessary to function effectively under pressure. The success of this mission validated his belief that he could contribute meaningfully to the fight against crime, while also demonstrating to both Batman and Nightwing that his interest in joining their mission was based on genuine capability rather than romantic fantasy or desire for adventure. The training that Batman eventually provided to Tim was designed to address both his obvious strengths and his significant weaknesses, building upon his exceptional analytical abilities while also developing the physical skills and practical experience necessary for active crime fighting in Gotham's dangerous environment. The program that was created for him reflected lessons learned from previous partnerships, while also accommodating his unique background and personality characteristics that differentiated him from both Dick and Jason in important ways. The academic approach that Tim brought to his heroic development was both an asset and a liability, providing him with systematic methods for acquiring and organizing knowledge, while also creating tendencies toward over-analysis and hesitation that could prove dangerous in situations requiring immediate action and intuitive response. The balance between thinking and acting that Batman sought to instill in him required constant attention and practice, as Tim's natural inclination toward comprehensive preparation sometimes conflicted with the reality that crime fighting often demanded split-second decisions based on incomplete information. The grief that Tim experienced following the death of his mother and the severe injury of his father created personal tragedy that paralleled the losses that had shaped both Batman and the previous Robins. Yet his response to these events demonstrated the emotional maturity and moral stability that distinguished him from his predecessors, while also confirming Batman's judgment in selecting him as Jason's replacement. The ability to process grief without allowing it to transform into consuming hatred or desire for revenge reflected psychological health that was essential for maintaining the ethical standards that defined heroic action. The costume and equipment that were prepared for Tim incorporated design elements that reflected both continuity with previous Robin identities and recognition of his individual characteristics and preferences, creating a visual representation of his role as both inheritor of an established legacy and unique contributor to the ongoing mission of protecting Gotham from criminal threats. The symbolism embedded in these choices reinforced his understanding of the responsibilities and expectations that came with the Robin identity, while also acknowledging his right to develop his own approach and methodology. The international training program that Tim completed before beginning active patrol duties provided him with skills and perspectives that supplemented Batman's instruction, while also exposing him to different philosophical approaches to combat and justice that broadened his understanding of the options available for addressing various types of criminal threats. The mentorship he received from figures like Lady Shiva challenged his assumptions about violence and morality, while also testing his commitment to the principles that Batman had sought to instill in him. The intellectual approach that Tim brought to detective work represented a significant evolution in the Robin legacy, as his systematic methodology and comprehensive analytical framework enabled him to solve cases and identify patterns that might have escaped detection through more intuitive or experience-based approaches. The balance between his technological sophistication and traditional detective skills created a hybrid investigative style that was uniquely effective while also serving as a bridge between Batman's classical methods and the emerging possibilities offered by advanced information systems. The relationship that developed between Tim and Batman was characterized by mutual respect and genuine affection that transcended the mentor-student dynamic to approach something resembling an intellectual partnership between individuals who shared similar interests and methodologies despite their obvious differences in age and experience. The conversations they conducted during investigations and training sessions revealed depths of understanding and appreciation that enriched both participants while also strengthening their effectiveness as a crime-fighting team. The encounters with major villains during Tim's early career as Robin provided him with opportunities to test his developing skills against opponents whose capabilities and methodologies represented different types of challenges and required different approaches to overcome successfully. The psychological profiles he developed of various criminals reflected his academic background, while also demonstrating practical understanding of the motivations and weaknesses that could be exploited to achieve victory without compromising moral principles. The independence that Tim displayed in his approach to crime fighting was both welcomed and concerning to Batman, who recognized the value of having a partner capable of independent analysis and decision-making, while also understanding the dangers that could result from insufficient coordination and communication between team members operating in complex and rapidly changing tactical situations. The balance between autonomy and supervision that they achieved required ongoing negotiation and adjustment as Tim's capabilities and confidence continued to develop. The legacy that Tim would eventually create as Robin was distinguished by its intellectual rigor and systematic approach to problem-solving, demonstrating that heroism could be enhanced rather than diminished by careful planning, thorough preparation, and comprehensive analysis of available options and their likely consequences. His contributions to the Robin tradition proved that different backgrounds and personality types could serve the cause of justice effectively while maintaining the essential values and principles that defined heroic action in its most admirable forms. In the shadowed corridors of history, where love and ambition intertwine to create consequences that echo across generations, there exist liaisons that transcend the ordinary boundaries of romance to become forces that reshape the destiny of nations and the fate of individuals yet unborn. The relationship between Bruce Wayne and Talia al Ghul was one such connection, born from the collision of two powerful personalities whose shared dedication to justice took radically different forms, and whose mutual attraction was complicated by ideological differences that made lasting partnership impossible despite the depth of their emotional and physical connection. Talia al Ghul represented everything that Bruce Wayne might have become. Had his path toward justice been guided by different principles and different mentors? A brilliant and capable woman whose commitment to improving the world was filtered through her father's ancient philosophy of necessary destruction and authoritarian control. Her beauty was matched by her intelligence, her compassion balanced by her ruthlessness, her genuine love for Bruce complicated by her absolute loyalty to Ra's al Ghul and the League of Assassins that had shaped her understanding of what justice required in a world corrupted by weakness and indecision. The brief liaison between Bruce and Talia occurred during one of those rare interludes in Batman's career when the demands of his mission had driven him beyond the familiar boundaries of Gotham City to confront threats that operated on a global scale, requiring him to work alongside individuals whose methods he could not entirely approve yet, whose goals aligned sufficiently with his own to make temporary cooperation possible. The attraction between them was immediate and mutual, based not merely on physical desire, but on the recognition of shared qualities and compatible intellects that might have formed the foundation for a lasting partnership under different circumstances. The conception of their child was unplanned and initially unknown to Bruce, occurring during a period when both parents were focused on immediate tactical concerns rather than the long-term implications of their relationship and the possibility that their connection might produce consequences extending far beyond their own lives. Talia's discovery of her pregnancy came after Bruce had returned to Gotham, leaving her to make crucial decisions about the future without his input or knowledge, choices that would be influenced by her father's ambitions and her own complex feelings about motherhood and legacy. The decision to conceal the pregnancy from Bruce was motivated by Talia's understanding of his character and her certainty that knowledge of the child's existence would create conflicts of loyalty and responsibility that might compromise both his effectiveness as Batman and his safety during operations that required absolute focus and commitment. Her choice to handle the situation independently reflected both her strength and her tragic misunderstanding of what partnership and shared responsibility could mean when built upon genuine trust and mutual respect rather than the hierarchical relationships that characterized her experience with Commerce, the League of Assassins. The artificial acceleration of the child's development was accomplished through scientific techniques that the League had perfected through centuries of experimentation with human enhancement and biological manipulation, methods that compressed years of natural growth into months while attempting to preserve the essential developmental stages necessary for psychological and intellectual maturation. The process was both a gift and a violation, providing the child with physical capabilities and cognitive abilities that exceeded normal human limitations, while also denying him the natural rhythm of childhood and the gradual acquisition of wisdom that comes from experiencing life at its intended pace. Damian Wayne emerged from this forced maturation as a creature caught between worlds, possessing the body and intellectual capacity of a child, approaching adolescence, while having been shaped by training and indoctrination that emphasized violence and domination as the primary tools for achieving objectives and maintaining control over one's environment. His education within the League of Assassins was comprehensive and ruthless, designed to create the perfect heir to Ra's al Ghul's legacy, while also serving as a weapon that could be employed against enemies who threatened the organization's goals and ambitions. The training that Damien received from his earliest consciousness was unlike anything experienced by children in conventional societies, incorporating not only advanced martial arts and weapons mastery, but also lessons in psychology, strategy, and the application of fear as a tool for controlling others and achieving desired outcomes. His instructors were drawn from among the League's most skilled operatives, individuals whose own moral boundaries had been eliminated through years of service to causes that demanded absolute obedience and unwavering commitment to methods that served efficiency over compassion. The philosophical foundation underlying Damien's education was built upon Ra's al Ghul's conviction that humanity was fundamentally flawed and required guidance from superior beings who possessed the wisdom and strength necessary to impose order upon chaos and eliminate the weaknesses that prevented lesser individuals from achieving their full potential. This worldview shaped every aspect of Damien's development, creating psychological frameworks that valued strength over mercy, efficiency over justice, and results over methods, while viewing emotional attachments and moral constraints as obstacles to be overcome rather than virtues to be cultivated. The combat skills that Damien acquired during his years with the League reflected not only technical mastery of various fighting disciplines, but also a tactical approach that prioritized defeating opponents through any means necessary, rather than limiting himself to methods that preserved their dignity or respected their rights as conscious beings. His training emphasized the identification and exploitation of weaknesses, the use of deception and misdirection to gain advantages, and the application of lethal force as the most efficient solution to problems that might otherwise require prolonged effort or complex negotiation. The psychological conditioning that accompanied this physical training was designed to eliminate qualities that the League viewed as weakness, while enhancing traits that served their vision of effective leadership and successful operation. In environments where survival depended upon the ability to make difficult decisions without being hindered by sentiment or conventional moral considerations, the empathy and compassion that characterized normal human development was systematically suppressed, while aggression and dominance were reinforced through training scenarios that rewarded ruthless efficiency and punished hesitation or mercy. The moment when Talia judged her son ready to meet his father represented a convergence of multiple factors, including Damien's demonstrated mastery of the skills she deemed essential for survival in Bruce Wayne's world, her own growing concerns about Ra's al Ghul's influence over the child's development, and strategic considerations related to the League's ongoing conflicts with various enemies who might be deterred by the knowledge that Batman had acquired a potential heir and successor. The decision to reveal Damien's existence was not made lightly, as it carried risks for all parties involved while also opening possibilities for healing and connection that might benefit both father and son. Bruce Wayne's reaction to discovering that he had a son was complex and multifaceted, encompassing shock at the revelation of Talia's deception, guilt about his absence during the child's formative years, and profound uncertainty about how to respond to a situation that challenged every assumption he had made about family, responsibility, and the compatibility of his dual identity with the possibility of normal relationships and parental obligations. The knowledge that his son had been raised and trained by the League of Assassins created additional complications, as it suggested that Damien's moral development might be incompatible with the principles that guided Batman's mission. The initial meetings between Bruce and Damian were characterized by mutual wariness and careful evaluation, as both participants struggled to understand each other's expectations and capabilities while also navigating the complex emotional territory that surrounded their father-son relationship and its implications for their respective approaches to justice and heroism. Bruce's attempts to connect with his son were hindered by Damian's conditioning and training, which had taught him to view emotional displays as weaknesses to be exploited rather than genuine expressions of care and affection. Damian's offer to serve as Robin represented both his desire to prove himself worthy of his father's respect and his understanding that partnership with Batman would provide opportunities to demonstrate the skills and knowledge he had acquired during his years with the League, while also giving him access to resources and experiences that might further his development as a warrior and leader. His approach to the role was necessarily different from that of his predecessors, reflecting his unique background and the different circumstances that had shaped his understanding of what heroism meant and how it should be practiced. The death of Bruce Wayne during the apparent victory of Darkseid over the forces of Earth created a crisis that tested Damian's psychological resilience, while also forcing him to confront questions about loyalty, identity, and purpose that his training with the League had not adequately prepared him to address. The loss of his father before their relationship had been fully established, or their differences reconciled, represented a form of abandonment that resonated with earlier traumas, while also creating urgency around his need to define himself, independently of both his parents' expectations and their competing visions of what his future should hold. Dick Grayson's assumption of the Batman mantle created an opportunity for Damian to continue his development as Robin, while working with a mentor whose approach to heroism differed significantly from both Bruce Wayne's methods and the League of Assassins' philosophy, offering him exposure to perspectives and techniques that might help him integrate the various influences that had shaped his character. The partnership between Dick and Damian was built upon genuine mutual affection and respect, rather than the complex mixture of duty, guilt, and expectation that had characterized Damian's relationship with his biological father. The brotherly bond that developed between Dick and Damian provided the young Robin with his first experience of unconditional acceptance and support from someone who understood the challenges and responsibilities of heroic service, while also offering guidance that was based on care rather than strategic calculation or ideological indoctrination. Dick's patience with Damian's aggressive tendencies and his ability to find constructive outlets for the young man's violent impulses demonstrated alternative approaches to channeling exceptional capabilities that opened new possibilities for growth and development. The adventures that Dick and Damian shared as Batman and Robin tested both partners' abilities, while also providing opportunities for Damian to experience the satisfaction that came from protecting innocent people and preventing harm, rather than simply defeating enemies and demonstrating superior capability. The gradual shift in his motivation from proving his worth to genuinely caring about the welfare of others represented significant psychological development that suggested the possibility of overcoming his earliest conditioning and embracing values that were more compatible with heroic service. The return of Bruce Wayne from his presumed death created new complications for Damian's development, as he was forced to navigate relationships with both his biological father and his beloved mentor, while also trying to understand his own identity and place within the larger mission that had brought them all together. The transition from working with Dick's more nurturing and collaborative approach to adjusting to Bruce's more demanding and systematic methodology required psychological flexibility and emotional maturity that tested the progress Damian had made during his time with the substitute, Batman. The philosophical conflicts that emerged between Bruce and Damian reflected fundamental differences in their understanding of justice and the appropriate methods for achieving it. With the son's training in lethal techniques and efficient problem-solving coming into regular conflict with his father's commitment to preserving life and working within legal frameworks whenever possible. These disagreements were not merely tactical disputes, but expressions of deeper questions about the nature of heroism and the responsibilities that came with possessing superior capabilities and knowledge. The Nobody incident represented a crucial test of Damien's moral development and his ability to resist the temptation to solve problems through the application of lethal force. Yet it also demonstrated the limitations of abstract moral principles when confronted with genuine threats to the safety of people he cared about and respected. The decision to kill Nobody was not made from sadism or lack of moral development, but from pragmatic calculation about the most effective method for preventing future harm, reflecting the persistent influence of his league training despite his genuine desire to honor his father's principles. Bruce's response to Damien's killing of Nobody reflected his understanding that moral development was a gradual process that required patience and consistent guidance, rather than harsh punishment or rejection. Yet it also demonstrated his recognition that his son's psychological formation had created challenges that could not be addressed through conventional disciplinary methods or simple appeals to ethical authority. The decision to spend more time with Damien as father and son rather than as mentor and student represented an attempt to provide the kind of emotional foundation and secure attachment that might enable healthier moral reasoning and decision-making. The revelation that Talia had created a clone of Damien added layers of complexity to his understanding of his own identity and purpose, while also introducing a direct threat that embodied everything he might have become if his development had proceeded along different paths and under different influences. The heretic represented the ultimate expression of the League's vision for Damien's future, a being whose capabilities matched or exceeded his own, while lacking the moral constraints and emotional connections that had begun to modify his approach to problem-solving and conflict resolution. The battle between Damien and the heretic was more than a simple physical confrontation between opponents with similar abilities and training. It was a symbolic struggle between different versions of what Damian Wayne might become, testing not only his combat skills but also his commitment to the values and relationships that had begun to reshape his understanding of what strength meant and how it should be employed. The outcome of this conflict would determine not only his immediate survival, but also the future direction of his character development and his role within the larger mission that had brought the Bat family together. The death of Damien at the hands of his own clone was a tragedy that transcended the simple loss of life to encompass the destruction of potential and the cutting short of a redemption narrative that had promised to demonstrate the possibility of overcoming even the most problematic childhood, conditioning through the power of love, patience, and consistent moral guidance. The sword that pierced his heart ended not only his physical existence but also his father's hopes for healing and connection, creating a loss that would influence Bruce Wayne's psychological state and decision-making for years to come. The resurrection of Damien through the combined application of advanced technology and mystical forces represented both the fulfillment of Bruce's desperate desire to restore his son and the demonstration of how far he was willing to go to undo losses that he viewed as fundamentally unacceptable. The process by which Damien was returned to life was complex and dangerous, requiring resources and alliances that tested the boundaries of what even Batman could accomplish through determination and strategic planning, while also raising questions about the natural order of life and death that had implications extending far beyond individual family concerns. The superhuman abilities that Damien acquired as a result of his resurrection provided him with capabilities that exceeded even his previously enhanced physical and mental attributes. Yet they also created new challenges and responsibilities that required him to rethink his approach to heroic service, while adjusting to powers that operated according to principles he did not fully understand. The temporary nature of these enhancements served as a reminder that all gifts came with limitations, and that true strength lay not in supernatural capabilities, but in character and moral development that could sustain effective action under any circumstances. The evolution of Damian Wayne from League of Assassins heir to genuine hero represented one of the most complex and psychologically sophisticated character arcs in the history of the Robin legacy, demonstrating that even the most problematic backgrounds and conditioning could be overcome through patient guidance, genuine love, and the consistent modeling of alternative approaches to conflict resolution and moral reasoning. His story served as proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to embrace growth and change, while also acknowledging the ongoing struggle required to overcome formative influences that had shaped fundamental assumptions about proof influences, power, relationships, and the meaning of strength in service to others. In the vast tapestry of heroic legacy, there exist threads that weave themselves into patterns both familiar and revolutionary. Stories of individuals who approached the mantle of Robin from directions so unexpected that their very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about what it meant to serve as Batman's partner and heir to a tradition that had been shaped by tragedy, privilege, and the complex interplay between mentorship and independence. Among these unconventional heroes, two figures stand as particularly compelling examples of how the Robin identity could be claimed and transformed by those whose circumstances and motivations differed dramatically from the established pattern, yet whose contributions to the legacy proved equally meaningful and transformative. The story of Stephanie Brown began not in the rarefied air of high society charity galas or the desperate streets of Crime Alley, but in the mundane dysfunction of middle-class mediocrity, where criminal ambition met suburban banality to create a household environment that was neither tragic enough to inspire sympathy nor privileged enough to provide genuine opportunities for growth and development. Her father, Arthur Brown, had chosen the peculiar criminal identity of Cluemaster, not from any desire for intellectual recognition or psychological complexity, but from a simple recognition that his natural inclinations toward elaborate planning and puzzle solving could be monetized through criminal enterprises that satisfied his need for attention while also generating income that conventional employment had failed to provide. The relationship between Stephanie and her father was complicated by her simultaneous admiration for his intelligence and creativity, and her growing awareness that his choices were causing genuine harm to innocent people, while also creating instability and danger for their own family. The knowledge that her comfortable suburban lifestyle was funded through criminal activities created moral conflicts that intensified as she matured, and began to understand the broader implications of her father's actions and the ways that his selfish choices affected not only his direct victims, but also the community that had to live with the consequences of his disregard for law and social responsibility. The decision to adopt the identity of Spoiler represented Stephanie's attempt to find a constructive outlet for the anger and frustration that had been building throughout her adolescence, transforming her resentment toward her father's criminal career into positive action that might prevent some of the harm his schemes would otherwise cause, while also asserting her own moral independence and commitment to principles that transcended family loyalty. The costume she created was deliberately amateurish and improvisational, reflecting both her limited resources and her understanding that effectiveness mattered more than professional appearance or sophisticated equipment. Her first successful intervention in one of Cluemaster's schemes demonstrated both her courage and her intuitive understanding of criminal psychology, as she managed to anticipate his methodology well enough to leave the kind of clues that would enable Batman and the police to apprehend him before his latest plan could reach fruition. The satisfaction she derived from this success was complicated by the knowledge that she had effectively betrayed her own father, yet it was also profound enough to convince her that she had discovered her true calling and the purpose that would give meaning to her existence. The encounter with Tim Drake during one of her early adventures, as Spoiler introduced her to the possibility that heroic service could involve partnerships and relationships that provided not only tactical support but also emotional connection and mutual understanding that transcended the isolation and secrecy that had characterized her previous experience. The chemistry between them was immediate and multifaceted, encompassing physical attraction, intellectual compatibility, and shared commitment to ideals that created the foundation for a relationship that would prove central to both their character development and their effectiveness as crime fighters. The pregnancy that resulted from her relationship with her ex-boyfriend created complications that tested her resilience and decision-making abilities, while also providing her with insights into responsibility and sacrifice that deepened her understanding of what heroism actually meant in practical terms. The choice to carry the pregnancy to term, despite the obvious challenges it would create for her crime-fighting activities, reflected moral convictions about the value of life that were consistent with her other heroic principles, while her decision to place the child for adoption demonstrated wisdom about her own limitations and the kind of environment that would be best for the baby's development and future prospects. The training that Batman eventually provided to Stephanie was offered reluctantly and with significant reservations about her suitability for the kind of systematic preparation that he believed was necessary for effective partnership in his mission. Yet it also represented his recognition that her natural abilities and demonstrated commitment deserved the opportunity to be developed and refined through proper instruction and guidance. The relationship between mentor and student was complicated by Stephanie's independent streak and her resistance to authority figures, qualities that made her effective as a lone operator, but created challenges when it came to coordinating activities and following strategic plans that required precise timing and absolute reliability. The revelation of Tim Drake's secret identity to Stephanie was a decision that Batman made with considerable hesitation, recognizing that such knowledge would fundamentally alter the dynamics of her relationship with both Tim and the larger Bat family, while also creating security risks that could potentially compromise the safety and effectiveness of their entire operation. Yet the practical necessities of coordinating their activities and the obvious benefits of allowing her access to resources and support that could enhance her effectiveness ultimately outweighed these concerns, making full disclosure seem like the least problematic of several imperfect options. The period during which Stephanie served as the fourth Robin was brief but significant, representing both her greatest triumph and her most tragic failure, while also demonstrating the complex challenges involved in maintaining the standards and expectations that had been established by her predecessors in the role. Her appointment to the position came during a period when Tim Drake was temporarily unavailable, and Batman's need for a partner outweighed his reservations about her preparedness and suitability for the enormous responsibilities that came with wearing the red and yellow costume that had become one of the most recognizable symbols in Gotham City. The War Games incident that marked the end of Stephanie's tenure as Robin was the direct result of her attempt to prove herself worthy of the role by implementing one of Batman's contingency plans without proper authorization or adequate preparation, a decision that reflected both her desire to contribute meaningfully to their mission and her fundamental misunderstanding of the complex factors that had to be considered before undertaking operations that could affect the entire criminal landscape of Gotham. The gang war that resulted from her unauthorized activation of this plan created chaos that exceeded everyone's ability to control or contain, transforming what should have been a strategic advantage into a catastrophe that claimed numerous innocent lives. The capture and torture that Stephanie endured at the hands of Black Mask was the inevitable result of her involvement in events that had spiraled beyond her ability to manage or escape. Yet it also provided her with an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of courage and resilience that defined true heroism even in the face of seemingly inevitable defeat and destruction. Her refusal to reveal information that might have compromised Batman's operations or endangered other members of the Bat family reflected moral strength that transcended her tactical errors and strategic miscalculations, proving that her commitment to their shared mission was genuine and absolute. The apparent death that concluded the War Games storyline was both real and illusory, as Stephanie's injuries were severe enough to require elaborate deception to convince even her closest allies that she had not survived the ordeal, while also providing her with an opportunity to disappear from Gotham and receive the kind of medical treatment and psychological support that would enable her eventual recovery and return to active service. The decision to maintain the fiction of her death was made partly to protect her from further retaliation and partly to provide her with the time and space necessary to process her traumatic experiences and decide whether she wished to continue pursuing a career in crime fighting. The return of Stephanie Brown to active heroic service represented both personal redemption and vindication of her potential, as she had used her time in recovery and exile to develop the kind of discipline and systematic approach to problem solving that her earlier impulsiveness had prevented her from acquiring through conventional training methods. Her evolution from reckless amateur to competent professional demonstrated that growth and learning were possible even after catastrophic failures, provided that the individual possessed sufficient courage and determination to confront their own limitations and work systematically to overcome them. While Stephanie Brown's story unfolded in the familiar urban landscape of contemporary Gotham, another Robin legacy was being written in a very different timeline and under radically altered circumstances that challenged every assumption about the nature of heroism and the relationship between power and responsibility. In the dystopian future depicted in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, the world had changed in ways that made traditional approaches to justice and heroic service inadequate or impossible, requiring new forms of courage and different types of sacrifice from those who chose to stand against the darkness that threatened to consume what remained of civilized society. Carrie Kelly's introduction to the world of vigilante justice came not through personal tragedy or inherited responsibility, but through the simple recognition that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses from anyone who possessed the courage and capability to make a plain difference. The 13-year-old girl who witnessed Batman's return from retirement was inspired not by romantic notions of adventure and excitement, but by practical understanding that Gotham's descent into chaos and violence could only be stopped by individuals willing to take personal risks in service of the common good. The decision to create her own Robin costume and equipment reflected both her resourcefulness and her understanding that effectiveness mattered more than official authorization or professional credentials. As the crisis facing their city was too urgent to wait for proper training or institutional approval, the materials she used were improvised and unconventional, yet they served their purpose adequately, while also demonstrating her ability to solve problems creatively and make the most of limited resources, qualities that would prove essential for survival in the dangerous environment that Gotham had become. Her first encounter with Batman during his confrontation with the mutants provided her with an opportunity to demonstrate both her courage and her practical value as a partner, as her intervention proved crucial in preventing what might otherwise have been a fatal outcome for Gotham's returning protector. The quick thinking and decisive action that she displayed during this crisis established her credentials as someone worthy of partnership with the Dark Knight, while also proving to herself that she possessed the kind of moral courage and tactical capability that heroic service required. The relationship that developed between Batman and Carrie Kelly was necessarily different from his previous partnerships with Robin, as the apocalyptic circumstances of their collaboration left little time for gradual development or systematic training, requiring instead an immediate working relationship based on mutual trust and shared commitment to their survival and the protection of innocent lives. The age difference between them was significant, yet it was also less important than their compatibility in terms of values and methodology, as both understood that their situation demanded pragmatic flexibility rather than rigid adherence to conventional approaches to crime fighting. The weapons and tactics that Carrie employed as Robin reflected the harsh realities of the world in which she operated, where traditional non-lethal methods were often inadequate for dealing with threats that showed no restraint or mercy toward innocent victims, requiring responses that were proportional to the actual level of danger rather than limited by idealistic principles that might have been appropriate under different circumstances. Her use of a slingshot and firecrackers demonstrated both creativity and recognition that effectiveness could be achieved through unconventional means that took advantage of psychological impact rather than relying purely on physical force. The family background from which Carrie emerged was characterized by neglect and disengagement rather than active dysfunction or criminal behavior, as her parents had apparently retreated into various forms of escapism and self-medication that left them unable or unwilling to provide the kind of guidance and support that their daughter needed during the crisis that was consuming their city. This abandonment by the adults who should have been protecting her created both freedom and burden, as she was forced to make crucial decisions about her own safety and future without the benefit of experienced counsel or emotional support. The training that Carrie received was necessarily practical and immediate, focused on developing skills that would enable her to survive and function effectively in combat situations rather than providing comprehensive education in detective work, martial arts, and the other disciplines that had been part of previous Robin's preparation for their roles. The urgency of their circumstances required accelerated development that emphasized adaptability and quick learning over methodical progression through established curricula, creating a partnership dynamic that was more egalitarian and collaborative than the traditional mentor-student relationships that had characterized Batman's previous alliances. The psychological resilience that Carrie displayed throughout her adventures with Batman reflected both natural strength of character and the kind of maturity that often develops in young people who are forced to confront serious responsibilities earlier than would normally be considered appropriate. Yet her ability to maintain optimism and hope despite the darkness surrounding them also demonstrated that heroism could emerge from sources other than trauma and loss. Her presence served as a reminder to Batman that not all strength came from suffering, and that sometimes the most powerful force for good was simple determination to make things better rather than to prevent them from getting worse. The evolution of Carrie's role from Robin to Catgirl, and eventually to Batgirl, represented her natural progression from junior partner to independent operator, while also reflecting the changing nature of the challenges they faced and the different types of leadership and tactical approaches that various situations required. Each identity she adopted brought different capabilities and perspectives to their partnership, while also allowing her to develop aspects of her personality and skill set that might not have been fully utilized if she had remained locked into a single role or set of expectations. The relationship between Carrie and the other characters in their dystopian world demonstrated her ability to inspire loyalty and cooperation from individuals who might otherwise have been difficult to motivate or coordinate, reflecting leadership qualities that transcended her age and experience, while also suggesting that heroism was fundamentally about character rather than credentials or institutional authority. Her interactions with the Sons of Batman and other allied groups showed that she understood how to balance individual initiative with collective action, creating synergies that enhanced everyone's effectiveness while maintaining the moral standards that separated heroes from mere vigilantes. The ultimate test of Carrie's development came during the final confrontations that would determine the fate of their world and the future of heroic resistance against the forces that threatened to destroy everything they valued, requiring her to demonstrate not only tactical competence and physical courage, but also the kind of moral leadership that could inspire others to make similar sacrifices in service of principles that transcended individual survival or personal advantage. Her performance during these crucial moments validated Batman's decision to accept her as a partner, while also proving that the Robin legacy could continue even under the most challenging circumstances, adapted and transformed, but retaining its essential commitment to hope and justice. The symbolic significance of Carrie Kelly's story extended far beyond the immediate narrative context to encompass broader questions about the nature of heroism and the ways that extraordinary individuals could emerge from seemingly ordinary circumstances to make crucial differences in the outcome of conflicts that seemed hopeless. Her example demonstrated that courage and determination were not limited by age, gender, or background, and that the most important qualifications for heroic service were moral clarity and the willingness to act when action was needed, regardless of the personal costs or risks involved. The legacy that both Stephanie Brown and Carrie Kelly created within the Robin tradition proved that the identity and its associated responsibilities could be successfully claimed and fulfilled by individuals whose paths to heroism differed dramatically from those of their predecessors, yet whose contributions to the cause of justice were equally valuable and meaningful. Their stories served as reminders that heroism could take many forms and emerge from diverse circumstances, while also demonstrating that the essential values and principles that defined the Robin legacy were strong enough to survive translation across different personalities, backgrounds, and even timelines, continuing to inspire new generations of heroes who would carry the tradition forward into whatever challenges the future might bring. The profound psychological implications of placing children in situations of mortal danger while expecting them to function as effective partners in humanity's most dangerous profession represent one of the most troubling and fascinating aspects of the Robin legacy, raising fundamental questions about development, trauma, and the hidden costs of heroism that extend far beyond the immediate physical risks to encompass lifelong patterns of thought, emotion, and relationship that shape not only the individuals directly involved, but also the communities and institutions they eventually come to influence and lead. The transformation of a child from ordinary civilian to active participant in violent confrontations with some of society's most dangerous criminals necessarily involves psychological adaptations that fundamentally alter their relationship with fear, danger, and mortality in ways that most human beings are fortunate enough never to experience or understand. The cognitive frameworks that allow young people to function effectively in combat situations require the development of mental structures and emotional responses that are fundamentally incompatible with normal childhood development, creating internal contradictions and psychological tensions that must be carefully managed to prevent serious long-term damage to personality formation and social integration. Dick Grayson's response to the traumatic loss of his parents and his subsequent recruitment into Batman's war on crime demonstrated the remarkable resilience that some individuals possess when faced with circumstances that would destroy others. Yet, his apparent success in adapting to these extraordinary demands also masked deeper psychological processes that would not become fully apparent until years later, when the accumulated stress of his double life began to manifest in relationship difficulties, identity confusion, and the kind of emotional numbing that characterizes many individuals who have been exposed to repeated trauma during their formative years. The acrobatic skills that had served Dick so well in his circus life provided more than simply physical advantages when translated to crime fighting. They also offered psychological benefits that helped him process and integrate his traumatic experiences through movement and physical expression that allowed him to maintain some connection to positive memories, while also transforming his grief into purposeful action. The sensation of flight that had once represented pure joy and family connection became a form of therapy that enabled him to transcend the limitations and restrictions that trauma typically imposes upon its victims. Yet the price of this adaptation was the gradual development of what psychologists recognize as hypervigilance and emotional detachment, defensive mechanisms that protected him from being overwhelmed by the constant exposure to violence and suffering that characterized his new life, while also preventing him from forming the kind of deep emotional connections that are essential for healthy psychological development. The skills that made him effective as Robin also created barriers to intimacy and vulnerability that would complicate his relationships throughout his adult life. The relationship between Dick and Bruce was further complicated by the complex mixture of gratitude, resentment, love, and fear that characterizes many relationships between trauma survivors and their rescuers, particularly when those rescuers also serve as authority figures who control access to resources, training, and opportunities for meaningful action. The power dynamics inherent in their partnership created psychological dependencies that were difficult to recognize or address directly, as both participants had legitimate needs that were being met through their collaboration, even as other needs were being neglected or suppressed. Jason Todd's very different background and personality created entirely different psychological challenges and adaptations, as his pre-existing trauma from poverty, abandonment, and street violence had already begun to shape his worldview and coping mechanisms in ways that made integration into Batman's methodical and morally constrained approach to crime fighting far more difficult and problematic. The anger and aggression that had been essential survival tools during his years in Crime Alley were not easily channeled into the kind of disciplined and measured responses that Batman's methods required. The psychological profile that emerged from Jason's training and early missions revealed an individual whose capacity for empathy and moral reasoning had been compromised by exposure to extreme hardship and violence during critical developmental periods, creating cognitive and emotional patterns that prioritized immediate effectiveness over long-term consequences and personal survival over abstract principles about justice and due process. His willingness to use excessive force reflected not sadistic tendencies, but rather pragmatic calculations, based on his understanding of how conflict resolution actually worked in the environments where he had learned to survive. The failure to adequately address these psychological differences and provide Jason with the kind of specialized support and intervention that his background required represented one of Batman's most significant mistakes as a mentor and father figure, demonstrating the limitations of even the most well-intentioned training programs when they fail to account for the specific needs and vulnerabilities of individual participants. The assumption that standard procedures and ethical frameworks would be sufficient to reshape someone whose formative experiences had been so dramatically different proved tragically misguided. The death of Jason Todd served as a brutal reminder that the psychological preparation for heroic service, however thorough and sophisticated, could never completely eliminate the risks and vulnerabilities that made such service inherently dangerous, particularly for young people whose judgment and decision-making capabilities were still developing and whose understanding of their own limitations might be compromised by inexperience or overconfidence. The specific circumstances of his murder also highlighted the ways that personal psychological needs and family dynamics could create tactical vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. The trauma that Batman experienced as a result of Jason's death created psychological changes that affected not only his own effectiveness and well-being, but also his relationships with all subsequent partners and protégés, as his increased caution and protective instincts conflicted with the practical requirements of training young people for dangerous work, while also interfering with his ability to form the kind of trusting and collaborative partnerships that had made his earlier relationships successful and mutually beneficial. Tim Drake's self-selected entry into the world of heroic service represented a fundamentally different psychological dynamic, as his decision was based on analytical assessment of need and opportunity, rather than personal trauma or recruitment by authority figures, creating a foundation for his development that was both more stable and more complex than that of his predecessors. His intellectual approach to crime fighting reflected not only his natural analytical abilities, but also his psychological need to maintain some sense of control and predictability in situations that were inherently chaotic and dangerous. The methodical way that Tim approached his training and preparation demonstrated healthy psychological patterns that included realistic assessment of risks and limitations, systematic skill development, and careful attention to the integration of his heroic activities with his civilian life and relationships. Yet these same qualities also created vulnerabilities, as his tendency toward over-analysis and perfectionism could become paralyzing in situations that required immediate action based on incomplete information and intuitive judgment, rather than comprehensive planning and logical reasoning. The loss of Tim's parents created psychological trauma that paralleled the experiences of his predecessors, while also testing his established coping mechanisms and forcing him to confront questions about identity, purpose, and belonging that his privileged background had not prepared him to address. His response to this crisis demonstrated both his resilience and his capacity for growth, as he managed to process his grief without allowing it to transform into the kind of consuming desire for revenge that had motivated both Batman and Jason Todd. Damian Wayne's psychological development was perhaps the most complex and challenging of all the Robins, as his artificial acceleration through critical developmental stages and his indoctrination into a philosophy that prioritized efficiency over compassion had created cognitive and emotional patterns that were fundamentally incompatible with the moral frameworks that guided Batman's mission. The psychological interventions required to help him develop more appropriate responses to conflict and more healthy approaches to relationships represented unprecedented challenges that tested everyone involved. The conditioning that Damian had received from the League of Assassins was not simply a matter of learning inappropriate techniques or accepting flawed moral principles. It involved fundamental alterations to his psychological architecture that affected his capacity for empathy, his understanding of cause and effect relationships, and his ability to form meaningful emotional connections with other people. The process of helping him develop more adaptive patterns of thought and behavior required patience, consistency, and specialized knowledge that went far beyond conventional training in crime-fighting techniques. The relationship between Damien and Dick Grayson during Bruce's absence provided crucial evidence about the kinds of interventions and approaches that could be effective in addressing the psychological damage that had been inflicted during Damien's early development, demonstrating that genuine care, consistent boundaries, and positive role modeling could begin to reshape even the most problematic behavioral patterns when applied with sufficient skill and dedication. The success of their partnership suggested that recovery and healthy development were possible even for individuals whose early experiences had been severely traumatic. The various psychological adaptations that each Robin developed in response to their unique circumstances and challenges revealed important truths about human resilience and the capacity for growth and change even under extremely difficult conditions. Yet they also demonstrated the lasting effects of trauma and the ways that heroic service could both heal and harm those who chose to dedicate their lives to protecting others. The coping mechanisms that enabled them to function effectively in dangerous situations often came at the cost of other aspects of their psychological development and social integration. The father-son dynamics that characterized Batman's relationships with each of his protégés were complicated by the intersection of mentorship, authority, emotional attachment, and shared danger that created both profound bonds and significant conflicts. As Bruce's own psychological issues and unresolved trauma influenced his ability to provide the kind of consistent and appropriate guidance that young people required for healthy development. His tendency toward emotional withdrawal and his difficulty expressing affection and approval created additional challenges for individuals who were already struggling with complex identity formation and self-esteem issues. The transition from sidekick to independent hero represented a crucial psychological milestone that each Robin had to navigate in their own way, requiring them to separate their sense of identity and self-worth from their relationship with Batman, while also maintaining the values and principles that had guided their heroic development. This process of individuation was complicated by the practical realities of their shared mission and the emotional investments that had developed over years of partnership and mutual dependence. The formation of independent identities like Nightwing, Red Hood, and Red Robin reflected not only personal growth and maturation, but also the psychological need to establish autonomy and self-determination that was essential for mental health and continued effectiveness as crime fighters. The success or failure of these transitions depended partly on Batman's ability to support and encourage independence, while also partly on each individual's capacity to integrate their experiences and develop coherent narratives about their own development and purpose. The cyclical nature of loss, recovery, and growth that characterized the Robin legacy revealed important patterns about how human beings process trauma and find meaning in suffering, demonstrating that the most profound psychological healing often occurred through service to others, and the development of relationships based on shared commitment to principles that transcended individual needs and desires. The willingness to risk personal safety in order to protect innocent people provided a sense of purpose and meaning that could counteract the nihilistic tendencies that often resulted from exposure to violence and injustice. The psychological impact of wearing the Robin costume and accepting the responsibilities that came with that identity extended beyond the individuals directly involved to encompass the broader community of heroes and civilians who were affected by their actions and inspired by their example, creating ripple effects that demonstrated the social and cultural significance of psychological resilience and moral courage in the face of overwhelming challenges and seemingly impossible odds. The therapeutic value of the found family relationships that developed within the extended Bat family provided crucial support and healing for individuals whose biological families had been destroyed or compromised by tragedy, demonstrating that psychological recovery and healthy development could occur even when traditional family structures were absent or inadequate. The bonds that formed between former Robins and other members of their chosen family created networks of mutual support that enhanced everyone's resilience and effectiveness, while also providing models for healthy relationship, formation, and maintenance. The evolution of Batman's approach to training and mentoring young heroes reflected his own psychological growth and learning from past mistakes. As he gradually developed more sophisticated understanding of individual differences and specialized needs that required flexible and adaptive responses rather than rigid application of standard procedures and expectations. His willingness to acknowledge his own limitations and seek assistance from others demonstrated the kind of psychological maturity that was essential for effective leadership and guidance of vulnerable individuals. The ultimate psychological legacy of the Robin tradition lay not in any specific individual's achievements or failures, but in the collective demonstration that human beings could transcend the limitations imposed by trauma, disadvantage, and even systematic psychological conditioning when provided with appropriate support, meaningful purpose, and relationships based on genuine care and respect. The courage that each Robin displayed in choosing to risk their own safety and well-being in service of others represented the highest expression of human potential and the most effective response to the darkness that threatened to consume both individuals and communities that lacked such examples of hope and moral leadership. The evolution of the Robin legacy through the decades of its existence represents far more than simple succession of individuals wearing similar costumes and carrying similar responsibilities, encompassing instead a profound transformation in the very nature of heroism itself, and the ways that extraordinary individuals could influence not only their immediate communities, but also the broader cultural understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. The modern era of superheroic activity had been fundamentally shaped by the examples set by those who had worn the red and yellow, their individual contributions combining to create a collective impact that extended far beyond the boundaries of Gotham City to influence heroes and civilians across the globe. The character development that Batman experienced through his relationships with each of his protégés represented one of the most significant psychological transformations in the history of superheroic literature, as the isolated and emotionally damaged vigilante who had originally emerged from his parents' murder gradually evolved into someone capable of forming meaningful connections and providing the kind of guidance and support that enabled others to achieve their full potential. The lessons he learned from each partnership forced him to confront his own limitations and blind spots, while also revealing previously hidden capacities for patience, empathy, and collaborative leadership that enhanced his effectiveness as both a crime fighter and a mentor. Dick Grayson's transition from traumatized orphan to accomplished leader demonstrated that the Robin identity could serve as a launching pad for heroic careers that eventually surpassed even Batman's achievements in terms of scope and influence. As Nightwing's leadership of the Teen Titans and his eventual role in coordinating superhero activities across multiple teams and organizations proved that the skills and values acquired during his time as Robin could be successfully translated into larger contexts and more complex challenges. His ability to inspire loyalty and cooperation from individuals with vastly different backgrounds and personalities reflected lessons learned during his formative years under Batman's tutelage, yet also demonstrated his own unique contributions to the art of heroic leadership. The tragic arc of Jason Todd's story and his eventual resurrection as Red Hood provided crucial insights into the darker possibilities inherent in the Robin legacy, while also demonstrating that even the most catastrophic failures could ultimately contribute to positive outcomes if the lessons they taught were properly understood and integrated into future practices. His willingness to employ lethal methods in pursuit of justice challenged Batman's moral frameworks, while also serving as a constant reminder of the prices paid by those who chose to dedicate their lives to fighting crime, creating ongoing tensions that forced all members of the Bat family to regularly re-examine their own principles and methods. Tim Drake's analytical approach to crime fighting represented a significant evolution in the tactical sophistication available to modern heroes, as his systematic methodology and technological innovations provided new tools and techniques that enhanced the effectiveness of individual operatives, while also enabling better coordination between multiple heroes working on related problems. His contributions to the development of advanced surveillance systems, forensic analysis techniques, and strategic planning protocols influenced not only Batman's operations, but also the broader superhero community's approach to intelligence gathering and threat assessment. Damian Wayne's complex journey from trained assassin to genuine hero illustrated the possibility of redemption and positive development, even for individuals whose early experiences had been severely traumatic and whose initial conditioning had been fundamentally opposed to heroic values, demonstrating that human potential for growth and change could overcome even the most problematic backgrounds when supported by appropriate guidance and genuine care. His eventual integration into the Bat family and his successful partnerships with other young heroes proved that the Robin legacy could accommodate and transform even the most unlikely candidates. The expansion of the Robin concept to include alternative versions like Stephanie Brown and Carrie Kelly demonstrated that the essential values and principles underlying the identity were strong enough to survive translation across different personalities, circumstances, and even timelines, while also proving that heroism could emerge from sources that differed dramatically from the established patterns, without losing the core characteristics that made the Robin legacy meaningful and effective. Their contributions to the tradition enriched its diversity, while also confirming its fundamental soundness as a framework for heroic development. The team-ups and collaborations that occurred between former Robins provided some of the most compelling examples of how shared experiences and compatible training could create synergies that exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone, as their different specialties and perspectives complemented each other to produce solutions and strategies that drew upon the full range of skills and knowledge that the Robin tradition had developed over time. The mutual respect and affection that characterized these partnerships demonstrated that the bonds formed during their shared service to Batman had transcended their original hierarchical relationships to become sources of ongoing support and collaboration. The rivalries and conflicts that occasionally emerged between different Robins also served important functions in the ongoing development of the legacy, as these tensions forced each individual to clearly articulate their own values and methods, while also providing opportunities for growth and learning through honest disagreement and competition. The debates about appropriate levels of violence, the proper balance between individual initiative and team coordination, and the long-term goals of their shared mission contributed to the intellectual and moral sophistication of their collective approach to heroism. The role that the Robin legacy played in major DC Universe events and crises demonstrated its significance beyond local crime-fighting activities, as former Robins consistently found themselves in positions of leadership and responsibility, during conflicts that threatened entire worlds or dimensional structures, proving that the skills and principles they had developed under Batman's guidance were applicable to challenges that exceeded any single individual's capability to address independently. Their contributions to victories over cosmic threats and their role in preventing universal catastrophes validated the investment that had been made in their training and development. The mentorship chain that connected Dick Grayson to Tim Drake to Damian Wayne created a tradition of knowledge, transfer, and skill development that ensured continuity of the Robin legacy, even as individual participants moved on to different roles and responsibilities, while also demonstrating how the lessons learned from each generation could be refined and improved through practical application and careful analysis of what worked most effectively under various circumstances. The willingness of former Robins to serve as teachers and guides for their successors proved that the values underlying their training included commitment to the continuation and improvement of the traditions they had inherited. The unique skills and perspectives that each Robin brought to their role reflected not only their individual backgrounds and personalities, but also the changing nature of the challenges that heroes faced as technology advanced and criminal threats became more sophisticated and internationally coordinated, requiring corresponding evolution in the methods and capabilities available to those who sought to protect innocent people from harm. The adaptation of Robin training and equipment to address new types of dangers demonstrated the flexibility and forward-thinking that characterized the best aspects of Batman's approach to heroic service. The relationships that each Robin developed with other members of the broader superhero community provided crucial networking and collaboration opportunities that enhanced their individual effectiveness while also contributing to the placided overall coordination and strategic planning that enabled heroes to address threats that no single person or team could handle alone, proving that the social and diplomatic skills that were part of Robin training had applications that extended far beyond their original contexts and purposes. The impact that the Robin legacy had on civilian populations in Gotham City and beyond was evidenced through polling data and social research that consistently showed higher levels of hope and civic engagement in communities where former Robins had been active, suggesting that their example of young people taking responsibility for protecting others had inspirational effects that motivated ordinary citizens to become more involved in addressing problems and supporting positive change in their own neighborhoods and social circles. The technological innovations and tactical developments that emerged from Robin-related activities provided benefits that extended throughout the superhero community and even into legitimate law enforcement and emergency response organizations. As techniques and equipment originally developed for crime-fighting applications proved useful for disaster relief, search and rescue operations, and various forms of public safety work that served civilian populations more directly than traditional superheroic activities. The academic and scientific research that was conducted on the psychological and sociological effects of the Robin phenomenon provided valuable insights into human potential for growth and positive development under challenging circumstances, contributing to advances in fields ranging from trauma, recovery, and resilience training to leadership development and team dynamics that had applications far beyond the superhero community and could benefit anyone facing difficult circumstances or seeking to develop their capacity for service to others. The literary and cultural analysis of Robin stories and their themes provided frameworks for understanding broader questions about heroism, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual development and social responsibility that enriched public discourse about ethics and values, while also demonstrating how fictional narratives could serve educational and inspirational purposes that contributed to positive character, formation, and moral reasoning in both children and adults who encountered these stories. The international influence of the Robin concept was evidenced by the emergence of similar mentorship programs and youth heroic organizations in countries around the world. As the success of Batman's approach to training and developing young heroes inspired other experienced operators to create their own versions of these relationships and institutional structures, spreading the benefits of systematic heroic education and support networks to regions that might otherwise have lacked such resources and opportunities. The economic impact of Robin-related activities included not only the direct costs and benefits associated with crime prevention and disaster response, but also the indirect effects of enhanced social stability and increased civic engagement that contributed to economic development and improved quality of life in communities where former Robins had been active, demonstrating that investments in heroic training and development could generate positive returns that justified their costs and supported arguments for continued support of such programs. The philosophical implications of the Robin legacy extended beyond practical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about human nature, moral development, and the possibility of creating institutional structures that could consistently produce individuals capable of extraordinary service and sacrifice in support of values that transcended personal interest and immediate gratification, suggesting that the example set by these young heroes might provide models for addressing broader social problems and challenges that required similar levels of commitment and effectiveness. The educational applications of Robin-related research and documentation provided valuable resources for training programs designed to develop leadership, teamwork, and ethical reasoning skills in various professional and volunteer contexts. As the detailed analysis of how these young heroes had overcome challenges and developed their capabilities offered practical guidance for anyone seeking to maximize their own potential for positive contribution and effective action in service of causes they considered important and worthwhile. The therapeutic potential of Robin's stories and examples was recognized by mental health professionals, who found that these narratives provided hope and inspiration for clients dealing with trauma, loss, and various forms of psychological distress, as the demonstration that young people could transform their painful experiences into sources of strength and purpose offered alternative perspectives on suffering that could support healing and recovery processes, while also encouraging continued engagement with life despite its inevitable difficulties and disappointments. The eternal nature of the Robin symbol and its associated values was reflected in its continued relevance and appeal across multiple generations of readers and audiences, proving that the fundamental human needs and aspirations that these stories addressed remained constant despite changes in technology, social structures, and cultural contexts, ensuring that the legacy would continue to inspire and guide future heroes who would face new challenges, while drawing upon the wisdom and example provided by those who had walked similar paths in previous eras and under different circumstances. In these chronicles of the Robins, we find reflected the eternal truth that heroes are not born but forged in the crucible of loss and choice. Each young soul who donned the red and yellow carried forward not just Batman's mission, but the profound understanding that darkness could be transformed into light, that tragedy could become triumph, that the orphaned and abandoned could find family in the most unexpected places. From Dick's acrobatic grace to Jason's street-smart intensity, from Tim's detective brilliance to Damian's conflicted legacy, each Robin added their own thread to the tapestry of hope that shields Gotham from despair. They remind us that courage comes in many forms, that growth requires leaving the nest, and that the greatest heroes are those who choose to protect others, despite having known protection themselves too briefly. Rest now, dreamer of heroic tales, and may your sleep be as peaceful as Gotham under the watchful eyes of those who learned that even the smallest light can hold back the deepest darkness, that even the youngest hearts can carry the heaviest responsibilities, and that legacy lives not in a name or costume, but in the choices we make when faced with the opportunity to serve something greater than ourselves.